Good evening. This is the Thursday, August 18th, 2022 meeting of the Board of Directors of the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority. A quorum is present, and we'll begin. First item is to approve our agenda for this evening. Can I have somebody move that into the record? Susan, seconded by Rich. All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? Thank you. Item number 2, public comment. Anybody from the public who wishes to address us can do so for 3 minutes. There's nobody in the room this evening. Deb, do we have anybody online?
We do. Mr. Mogensen, you are unmuted.
Go ahead, Mr. Mogensen. You're muted.
Yes, this is Jim Mogensen. So the first thing to say is congratulations on the passage of the millage. And then now a couple of other observations. I would like to hope that the staffing of the Ypsilanti Transit Center is incorporated in the budget as a whole. I think it might have been part of the millage, but I think in terms of the AATA having equity across the whole system, addressing those kinds of issues in the broader context is helpful. Relating to the fares, the announcement seemed to suggest that the fare was related to the passes. And this is another one of those details, but so we have people who get paid through third party through the M card, and then you have people who don't work for the university but still work in the city or are able to or have enough resources to buy a pass. And as a person who has been a person who hasn't had the resources, didn't have the cash to actually buy a pass, you have a situation where the various lowest income people, even with the fair deal, are still paying more than they don't get the discount if you're just paying an individual fare. So I think it's important to keep those kinds of things in mind that will not be part of the usual fare, right? Nobody is opposed to having the fare reduction, but it does impact different groups of people who are utilizing the ride. And finally, with the millage, you have a situation where I think it's important. This is a long-range plan that is funded in 5-year blocks. And I think you have to make sure that at the end of when the next millage comes up, you have lots of stuff that people can say, we got them this money. And so if all the money goes into an account to pay for the BRT on Washtenaw, I believe you'll begin to have more political problems. We all understand how that works, but if it's all set aside, understandably, for that kind of a capital project, you need to make sure that riders are also seeing those improvements and having it not all banked into that escrow account. So as always, thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Deb, do we have anybody else who wants to address the board this evening?
We do. Robert Pawlowski, you are unmuted.
Good evening. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Robert Pawlowski from Southgate, Wayne County. So the one thing I'd like to address is a congratulations on the millage. It was a really great turnout, and I think that we had great support. Our stakeholders and also our public were heavily involved with it. The amount of public feedback that was provided throughout the process, from going into Ypsi to Briarwood Mall, to our public libraries, we did a major change in what we saw in the system. Everybody, even people that didn't even ride the bus, were absolutely satisfied, and they were just, blown away of what the progress was going on here at TheRide. So I just want to say thank you. And the amount of support, even from top legislation in Lansing, that's absolutely amazing. We had local volunteers from Transportation Riders United in Detroit help us volunteer and promote this millage on election day. So I want to give a big shout out to them and say thank you for everything that you did to help out the system. And, all the hard work that Matt put in to make this happen. I just want to give a big thank you to Matt as well. We have a long way ahead of us, but I think we have a lot of potential, and, we're going to see future progress in the system. So again, thank you for everything that went on, and I look forward to future progress, especially with this new passing millage. But other than that, thank you for the time and opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Deb, do we have anything else?
We do not.
Okay. Thank you. We'll close the public comment period. And we'll move on to 1.3, general announcements. Are there any general announcements from anyone on the board or the staff? Mr. Carpenter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have a wonderful team, staff team over at the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority, and professional development is a big part of that. And I want to take this moment to ask the board to join me in congratulating one of our own who is moving up and moving on. Our Deputy CEO of Operations, Mr. Brian Smith, has recently accepted a position as a CEO with the transit agency in Lafayette, Indiana, City Bus. So we have been very fortunate to have Mr. Smith as part of our team, I believe, since 2016. He's been a tremendous asset, has overseen many, I think, big and small changes, but one of the things I appreciate the most has been his stewardship of a real generational change, particularly in the agency and of our leadership of our operations group. So I wanted to ask the board to join me in congratulating Brian, and perhaps he could say a few words.
Brian, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate your kind words, and to the board. It has been an honor to serve as the Deputy CEO of Operations. We have had quite a ride over the last 5 years, and I have learned a tremendous amount, and saw this opportunity come up in Lafayette, and thought that it would be a good fit for me in another college town. So I can only just say thank you very much for the opportunity to serve the citizens of Ann Arbor and Ypsi. And hopefully I can take some of my lessons learned and put them to good use in Lafayette and West Lafayette, Indiana, where I've learned that there is already very much a distinction. Which side of the river have I visited more? So I will have to doff my Michigan Wolverines and find a Purdue Boilermakers hat. But I will not forget my time in Ann Arbor. And I truly appreciate all of the opportunities that I've had and the support, both of Matt and the executive team and of the board in those times that I've served in Matt's stead. So thank you. And I will miss you all.
Well, thank you, Brian. I mean, for myself, you can't be given enough credit for what you did for this agency during calling it a generational shift during a global pandemic. Can't be underestimated. I mean, you simply can't get enough credit for what you did to keep this agency going and afloat, and all of the adaptations and all of the adjustments through the finances. And I can speak for myself, but not only guiding us through that pandemic, overseeing monumental shifts in staffing levels and funding and all kinds of challenges that there is no school for. And to see you and Matt and the other staff adjust in real time to that was a great, I won't say a comfort, but it gave us a lot of confidence that this agency was going to keep going. I personally appreciate your dedication, the elevation of our services in terms of transforming them, both our fixed route service and the paratransit service, and kind of reshaping what you did for that is going to have a long-lasting impact on that board, on our agency. And I also appreciated the communication you had with the board and laying things out so people who are not operations engineers can understand just what the heck you're talking about, and that's a sign of somebody who really knows what they're doing and what they're talking about. And really, if you can take something complex like transit operations and break it down for the public who can understand it, that's a real talented person. So we are sad to lose you, but Lafayette is getting a good one, and so congratulations to them. And if any other board members want to say anything to Brian, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it.
Go ahead.
Brian, this is Ryan. I don't know if you can see me, but I just wanted to say congratulations to you. This is incredible, and you are so deserving of this opportunity. So I know we will miss you here, but the people where you're going will be blessed with your expertise. So wishing you every good success in the future.
Kathleen?
Brian, I have to say I've watched you grow. I've known you since before I was on the board. We had the pleasure of working together when I was with the local advisory council. To see the systems that you put in place, the way that you work with people, the way that you have brought everything along has been good to watch, but also engaging and beneficial to our ridership. And I can't say enough about how proud I am to have known you and the legacy that you're leaving behind. We appreciate you. And again, echoing what other people have said, sad to see you go, but your new home is very lucky to have you.
Thank you very much.
Jesse?
Brian, I'm very sad to see you go, but I'm so excited for the opportunities that that you have. I've always been amazed with and impressed by the compassion that you show both for your staff and for riders. I remember like my first or second board meeting when someone was here and was talking about an issue that they had. And you made it a point of talking to them. And whenever that happened, you always made a point of talking to people to find out what the problem was and to get it addressed. And that it just comes from such a place of compassion. And I'm really excited that you're going to be bringing that attitude and that ethic to another transit agency. They're very lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Mike?
Brian, rather than just echoing what other people have said, and I certainly agree with all that, I just wanted to tell you personally, you have done an amazing job under I'm sure, far more difficult circumstances than you ever could have anticipated in coming to the ride. And what you did to get everybody through this is just incredible. And I'm sure you have learned a lot from that. And let's hope you don't have to face these kinds of things again. We will all really miss you. We all really appreciate what you've done. And we think that Lafayette and West Lafayette will really treasure you also. Thanks again, Brian.
Thank you very much. I did insert into my contract that I had one pandemic per career. So I've checked that box. Good to go.
I think Matt is becoming a little like Bill Belichick. You got your own coaching tree now with people, at least in Indiana, people are kind of, they're going to start picking off your offensive, defensive coordinators one by one as we keep going. You don't seem happy about that, but yeah, I mean, you're breeding them. Good for you. All right, Kathleen?
I don't want to take away from Brian, but I just want to say to Mr. Carpenter that with John and with Brian, both who were deputy CEOs under your management or your executive leadership, you should be proud that they have not made a lateral or a downward move, that you have people who have watched you and how you have grown and how you have managed. And so therefore, they have been able to take the next steps in their career. And so I know that this is a really difficult time for the agency. It's always hard when you lose an executive team member and a friend, but you should also feel really good knowing that it was, you had something to do with it because of your example and your leadership. So
Anybody else? Susan?
I would just like to ask the other board members to join me with a round of applause. Well done. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, all. I can't say much more without starting to cry. So thank you.
I think it's a good way to end it. All right, we'll close the general announcement unless there are any more. Please tell me there's nobody else leaving. All right. We'll move on then to section 2, the consent agenda. We have board meeting minutes from July, last month, meeting summaries, and the FY23 board meeting dates, which are slightly revised. Can I have somebody move the consent agenda into the record? Ryan, seconded by Kathleen, all in favor? Any opposed? Passes unanimously, thank you. We'll move on then to section 3, policy monitoring and development 3.1. Well, we did something a couple of weeks ago. We won some election or something, and so thank you. No, congratulations to everybody. I mean, there's just not enough thank yous and congratulations to go around to everybody around the table. But thank you, and from my mind, especially the ballot committee, which was Mike Alamain and Susan Pale and Jesse Miller, who did outstanding work for this. Raising money, getting endorsements, getting the message out there, finding there was just all kinds of things, and especially for our consultants, Blue Path Consulting, who without whom to shepherd us through this, we wouldn't have probably made it. So congratulations, and my takeaway is now that we've won, we've got this long-range plan to refer to, and we won't win again unless we execute and deliver on everything that we promised in there, and we keep communicating how we're doing and how we're doing it and what we're doing to the people who expected our support. We cannot come back in 4 years just to show up for more money and say, hey, give us some more. We're gonna have to keep making sure that people understand what services we're delivering and when, and keep putting that message out there. And that's gonna be the best way to get ridership levels back up to pre-pandemic levels as well, to make sure that people know these extra service enhancements are there. They follow through with capital projects, et cetera. So once again, thank you to the voters. And if anybody has anything more to add, please do so. Any questions about anything regarding the millage? All right. We'll move on then to 3.2, monitoring improvements, and I think that will be Mr. Alamain.
Okay, thank you. At last meeting, I talked about that we were pretty happy, the task force was pretty happy with what's been developed with the new format for evaluating the monitoring reports, and also the way it was designed to be used online. But I did say that we wanted to, before we made a recommendation to the board, we wanted to test it out on a second monitoring report. And I also mentioned that we had started discussing, but hadn't really gotten much into talking about how we would propose that the board votes after filling out the forms to replace the A, B, C, D kinds of votes that we do today, and that would be consistent with the new format. So we did have a meeting on August 4th. For one thing, we unfortunately had to say goodbye to a very valuable member of our task force and a very valuable board member, and also of the finance committee, and that's of course Raymond Hess. And so we were down to only 2 task force members, myself and Kathleen. And first of all, Kathleen and I didn't feel that we could be in a position to recommend anything to the board with only just 2 people. And we needed to have a good replacement for Raymond. And fortunately, Kyra Sims stepped up, and she is the new member of our task force. and she will be attending her first meeting on September 1. The main discussion that we had during that meeting on August 4, and it was very robust with lots of different opinions, really focused on how we would actually implement the ratings through the board and how we would vote differently than we're currently voting now. And it turned out to be a much tougher nut to crack than I think anybody had anticipated. Once we got into the full discussion about what would have to be done and how might it be done. And so, as I said, we had a robust discussion, but we certainly weren't in a position to come to any conclusion on that. Rose Mercier, who has been advising us and been very helpful, will be, prior to the next meeting, seeing if she can take what we discussed in the meeting, and of course she was part of that meeting, and try to synthesize that into something that would be workable for having the board to vote, because you have the first stage, which is really having the board evaluating and filling out the new form. But then, what happens after that? And it's pretty complicated to get that into a way to reflect a board consensus. And so that's basically what we were challenged with. But we have our next board meeting on September 1. Kyra will be part of our task force at that time. I think that Rose Mercier will have some additional thoughts and suggestions about how the practicalities of a voting system might work. I think it has to be a little different and a little more simplified than what we were contemplating before. But I'm pretty confident that we will be making more progress. Kyra has to get up to speed, but we're certainly going in the right direction. And I'm confident that we will be able to bring to the board fairly soon. I'll make no prediction about the exact month, pretty soon with a recommendation. Let me ask the other task force member who is here tonight, Kathleen, if there's anything that she wants to add or clarify what I said.
I don't think I have anything to add, Mike. You were quite thorough in your explanation. And welcome, Kyra.
Any questions for Mike or Kathleen?
Okay, to be continued.
Mike, do you think, by October, November, or October, maybe you could have something for us? 60 days?
I hope so.
Okay.
It's just turning out to be more difficult and more complicated than we thought.
Got it.
I
Understood.
in being able to test drive it again on a different monitoring report, I think in itself is going to take some time, and then discussing that and seeing what we learn from that. I think probably October might be a little optimistic.
Okay. Well, we'll keep making progress. Thank you. Any other questions from Mike, Kathleen? All right, then we'll move on to monitoring report for policy 2.2, treatment of staff. It starts on page 14 of your packet, and I will let Mr. Carpenter lead us through it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Pleasure this evening to present the monitoring report for the treatment of staff. It was reviewed by the service committee, and I believe they voted to accept the report as compliant, I think as a level B, except for items maybe noted. The board may remember that this particular monitoring report was something of a disappointment last year. The board did not accept it as compliant, asked me to come back in October of last year with a bit of an update, which we did. talking about some of the steps we were going to be working on with staff and adjustments to the monitoring report. I think we've made some progress. A lot of those changes have been incorporated into the report before you. We are reporting general compliance, as you can see. We did retain the staff survey, and generally speaking, there's, in any staff survey, it's a snapshot in time. Some areas went up, some areas went down. There was tremendous improvement, for example, in the bus operations department among the morale of bus drivers particularly, which was really nice. But the overall scores you can see, if you look to page 17 of your packet, the evidence pertaining to policy 211, I think, is perhaps the area I'll highlight in the report. You do see some of the overall scores for staff there. We've also clarified some of the
I'm sorry, did you say 211 or 221?
221, excuse me, I misspoke. 221 on page 17 of the packet. So like I was saying, we did retain the staff survey. Generally some improvements there, some ups, some downs. Generally, I would characterize the results as flat. They were roughly the same as last year. We did clarify also some of the objective factual information, particularly around the attrition, voluntary departures. You can see that information there, far below Bureau of Labor Statistics information for comparable industries, be it transportation or local government. So although we are generally presenting the report as compliant, I certainly don't think our work with staff on engagement is through. We have a lot of areas we want to work on. Executive team, senior management team have been going over the results of this report and the staff survey, identifying some key areas we want to work on with staff, particularly slowing down some of the business processes to allow all staff up and down the organization to have more meaningful time to process and have feedback and input into some of the changes that we proposed. We realized in retrospect the last several years have been something of a race, and we haven't always created the space for those conversations. So that's one area. Increase in training being another one that we're happy to be able to do now that people can actually meet in person, which was nice. So in addition to the report that's before you, you'll see we did have enough, several board members responded to the survey, which is great. We also have some comments from Rose Mercier about the nature of the policy itself that the board could also consider. So with that, Mr. Chair, turn it back to you for discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Questions or comments from anybody on the board? Sorry. Oh, Kathleen, I'm sorry.
So I wanted to reiterate what Mr. Carpenter just said about the letter at the back of our of that packet with regards to Rose Mercier and her recommendations. She's been very clear that when we developed policy governance, there was a lot of language of thou shalt not fail to, and the governance coach has been changing that policy. They've been changing their wording, and so she has several great examples of wording changes that we might want to consider. And I don't want us to lose this. And I'm asking that we do look at it either at the governance level or the service committee level to look at Rose's recommendations and then make our own recommendation to the full board for those language changes. I don't know how anybody else feels about that.
Any response? No, I think it's a good idea to debate and talk about that, and probably governance is probably the best committee to do that, I think. Anybody else? Susan?
Yeah, just a question maybe about the staff survey. And it's, what, at a policy level, what I'd be interested to know from maybe future surveys, what should be changed to make a staff member feel more connected, more engaged, happier working at the agency? Because I see the highly, I would recommend, I would like to stay here, I would recommend it to others. But at a policy level, I don't know what to do with this. Like if there's something that the survey could pull out that we could do something with, I think that would be useful. And I say that just because my former job, the city conducted a number of staff surveys, and it just never felt fruitful. It never really got to the heart of what could be changed to enable people to feel more connected or more happy at their workplace. So it's just maybe a request for, or a question for future surveys. If we could pull out of it something that we as a board would understand, that we could try to support, a change of some kind. And I don't know what it is. I just, again, I don't want to get into the business that you're conducting. But at this level, I don't know. I don't know what to do with this other than happy, not happy. And just having seen a number of these at a different employer, I wasn't sure what to do with those either. I'm not even sure what they were doing those surveys for, if changes weren't really going to be happening. And the changes come from something specific. So I guess I'm curious to see if future surveying could help us arrive at more specific thing. You spoke to training. Is it learning how to manage other people? Is it a training on the road with the vehicle? Is it a training? I mean, I don't know what those things are that would enable staff to feel more supported in the work that they're doing. So maybe it's just a general question. Without us getting into your business, just to know more about what that is.
Mike, Matt, any response to that? I mean, my own personal response is I think there is a kind of a line we probably would trip over. We started pulling out some data and say, hey, Matt, go do this, or Matt, go do that, or based on specific responses, I would, but yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at, which is what are the actionable things that we could draw out of this to say, yeah, that's one specific behavior that we could either game plan for, or we could incorporate it in terms of our monitoring to say, let's do more of that, and we can make sure we have that as a goal to enforce with the CEO. So I think that's kind of under what I interpret that you're getting at.
And I think you're helping me to do a better job. A good example is we have the role of approving a budget. If what staff needs, for instance, is more training, we would then ensure that the budget contains sufficient funds so those trainings could take place. Sure. And that's where I think our involvement would take place, but I'm just not sure at this level what we could do to support the chief executive and the work that they're doing.
Yeah, and I think what we ended up doing last year was instead of adopting it as compliant or partially compliant, we asked the CEO to make some adjustments, come back with a plan to address some of those things. And we could do the same again if we wanted to see specific actions saying, hey, we'd like to see some actionable items. I mean, we could make this a policy that we review again in 6 months to say, hey, we'd like to see some uptick in this or that. I'm not, the attrition rate's actually pretty good, but if we want to say, hey, we want to see some improvement in attrition rate, what could we do to flatten that out, et cetera, something like that. Without, again, trying to bleed it over into actual staff management type of thing. So I don't know if you have any particular thoughts about that, but if not, I'll go to Mike.
Something that, came to mind was just to make sure the resources are there for what needs to be done. Again, keeping it at our level, not micromanaging.
Sure.
I think Mike also had a comment.
Yep. Mike, go ahead.
First of all, I would like to compliment Matt and the staff. This is quite an improvement since the last one we saw. And I think everybody is very appreciative of that. Also wanted to reinforce the comment that was made earlier by Kathleen about Rose Mercier's memo that's attached to this. We did discuss that briefly at the monitoring task force meeting. I think we were all in agreement with Rose when she said really addressing those points in that memo is not something for staff. It's really something for the board because it's really focusing on policies themselves and some policies that maybe even shouldn't be there, others that maybe are not expressed well. And so I just wanted to reinforce that. And again, make the distinction that that is certainly a board, something for the board to address and not for staff. Let me also mention that I did have one negative vote in terms of compliance, and that had to do with 2221, failed to provide internal controls necessary to enforce the policy. And I had a problem with an evidence, and specifically under data, a statement was made, non-union department managers are responsible for monitoring and correcting performance based upon agreed expectations. I personally did not think that that was adequate evidence. We're just saying what the policy was. That wasn't evidence that the internal controls are there. It just says the controls are in the hands of the manager, whatever those might be. So I just wanted to say that I was in a small minority in disagreeing with that being adequate evidence.
Thank you, Mike. Others? Jesse?
I'd actually like to hear the CEO's response to Mike's concern about 2221.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This policy pertains to the existence and enforcement of a number of basic personnel rules that many of us might be familiar with from HR handbooks at almost every employer. 2221 speaks to the necessity to provide internal controls necessary to enforce those policies. This gets very close to personnel discipline and the enforcement of that, which is covered usually by privacy regulations and laws. So in this particular area, our interpretation is that compliance will be demonstrated when mechanisms for holding staff accountable to expectations described in the policy exist. And that the managers are responsible for monitoring and correcting the employee based on agreed expectations. It is perhaps not the best written interpretation. Something worth perhaps revisiting.
Jesse, follow up?
Thank you. I'll wait for Mike to say whether he really wants to push on that. My own concerns have to do with 221 and 2211, particularly your use of aggregated percentages to justify as evidence of compliance. We definitely spoke about this at the service committee meeting, but I'm inclined to according to your interpretation, I don't feel like your evidence supports your assertion of compliance. Your justification for 50% being reasonable is because it's a majority, but there's no evidence. There's no why is 50% of your subjective survey is that why is that doesn't really say why 50% should be the threshold, and to me it seems like a low threshold, though perhaps there's a reason why you selected 50% that's not written down. I'd like to hear. I think you spoke to that a little bit in the service committee meeting, but I think since it's not written here, I'd like you to speak to that. But also that certain individual questions received less than 50%, but since you then chose to average scores, that would, so there's like a 47% response that was kind of balanced out by a 62%. I think if you're using 50%, it should be at least 50% on all things, or else I would have to think, it would not be in compliance, by the same rationale. You could have 100% agreement on one and 0% on another, and that would be considered, and that would meet your 50% threshold. So I don't find that tactic of averaging the scores to be sufficient. But if you wanted to, I want to give you a chance to respond to each of those concerns.
Thank you. There is an additional bit of context for why 50% that, yes, was not written down. Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. In speaking with the private third-party company that administers this anonymous survey, we asked them to help us contextualize these results and ask them what's normal for an organization like ours. And it's important to put that in context because of what I call the recreation and parks, or parks and recreation effect. And bear with me for just a moment. Once upon a time, I led a transit agency that was a municipal department. We were in the same division with the Parks and Rec, and we would do similar surveys across that corporation. And Russ ran Parks and Rec. His scores were always better than mine. And Russ always gave me a really hard time. But Russ would also admit that his employees, frankly, had a lot of fun. Lifeguards, taking care of child care camps. The people who are coming to recreate were generally pretty happy coming to recreate. Our staff help people commute to work. It's a slightly different context that they operate in. So that effect, I think, can be extrapolated to other industries. So we asked the administrator of this survey, Candace Goodwin, what's normal for us? She said 45 to 55% would probably be an acceptable range of performance for you guys in a transportation function. So we really appreciated that. And thank you, Mr. Miller. It wasn't written in here and probably should be added. In terms of why these three and the averaging of it, the survey asks 30, 40 questions. We have to pick some of them and provide them and try to make them relevant to this. I'll leave it up to you as a board to decide if their interpretation is reasonable and if this particular evidence is compelling or deficient. I will add, however, in creating these monitoring reports, we regularly look at monitoring reports from other organizations. This one in particular, after last year, we went back and looked at as many other policy governance using organizations we could find to see how they conduct this. I did not find any other organizations that use staff survey information in their monitoring report at all. Most of these reports referred to the existence of rules published in staff handbooks. None of them made any attempt to seek input from staff on how staff's perspective of compliance. So I think, admittedly, I think we could want some of the numbers to be better. I certainly want some of the numbers to be better, and we'll be working with my staff in that degree. But I also think I am proud that we have taken that step of transparency of at least seeking feedback. We didn't present you only the attrition rate, which I think arguably could be a compelling demonstration of completeness. We have always also provided the survey information as well. And I think the two things complement each other. So I think that's by way of a response.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. And I meant to commend you on the your attrition rates being exceedingly, like, way better than the other sectors, or the transportation, warehousing, utilities sector, and local government. I think that's to be commended. think that says a lot about, especially knowing how many people are leaving their jobs right now, knowing that our attrition rate is so much lower over the past year, I think says a lot about the workplace that we have. That said, and this is, I guess, more to my fellow board members, I'm inclined to say that 221 and 2211 are not compliant according to the CEO's interpretation, because of the averaging. I don't find the averaging to be, I feel like that's masking the intent, that if we're, these individual questions, if they are important, the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority encourages different points of view. We have a 36% agreement rate on that, I think is being masked at, being averaged with other scores. So I don't personally find that that is evidence of compliance, but I'd like to hear from other people.
I mean, my only personal view is look at we got a 36%, but does that mean that we fail to operate in a work environment or we are operating in a work environment that devalues humanity, creativity, and knowledgeable contribution because we got 36% on one thing? Not to me. I don't think that means we failed the whole policy because we got 36% on one question. The question is, are we compliant, or is the staff compliant with 2211? Not are we ultimately hitting a certain percentage on a survey. So, I mean, I don't mind the grouping, because really what we're speaking to is a higher, more general level of compliance with the wording here. And if getting 36% or getting below 50% on one or two items, and admittedly, we don't have the whole survey, so we can't judge it all. But if not getting 50% on one or two of these means we failed the whole policy, I'm open to that one. But the real question for me is not so much did we hit a certain percentage, but are we not in compliance, or not we as the staff not, or are they in compliance with the wording as we interpret that to be? So really what we're saying, is that reasonable for him to say, I'm in compliance even though one or two of these is below 50%? So that's the real question. And I'm open for debate too. Ms. Sims?
I'm okay with 50% being the threshold. I don't agree with saying that 2211 is not compliant because, like you said, Eric, the 36%. I think for me, one of the concerns is within the higher policy, we have the devalues the humanity, creativity, and the policy goes on. I'm a little worried about the creativity part because these low percentages, the 36% and the 44%, talk about new ideas and encouraging different viewpoints. And so that portion of it, it looks like we're not doing well there. And I think that's something that, I'm sure Matt's aware of, and we can work to improve that particular area, because that's, to me, showing that there might be like a pattern where people aren't feeling comfortable or aren't feeling acknowledged if they're bringing new ideas to the table. And that's important to keeping employees happy and with the organization. But I do think we're doing really well in a lot of these other areas that we were not doing well at the last time we saw this report. And one of my comments was the 67% for feeling genuinely appreciated is really great in this work environment. I think that's really important and contributes to our impressive attrition rate. So I'm okay with saying that 2211 is compliant, with a comment that we should keep an eye on that creativity portion of the policy.
Thank you. Yeah, 67% I think is quite good in the quiet quitting era that I keep reading about. Kathleen?
I also would like to add that 11% more staff responded to this than the prior staff survey. And so to me, that is also compelling, that more people were willing to give their point of view. Surveys are difficult for people, and even though they may be anonymous, people don't always trust them and don't always want to participate. So I think the fact that more persons participated in this survey is also telling. In addition, I agree completely with Kyra, and I also understand Jesse's point of view about the data being aggregated, and so it looks like things are being missed. But I also feel that those points, I trust Matt. And I trust his leadership. And I trust that he's going to look at those numbers that Kyra especially just pointed out that are maybe cause for future consideration and concern, and that he's going to act upon that and do better to help the staff come along and feel like they can have a voice and be more creative. So I'm fine with leaving it as compliant. Yeah, so that's what I have to say.
Rich?
So this is an interesting one for me because actually as I think about this more, I do tend to see where Jesse's coming from in this. And it actually goes to what Kathleen just talked about is like, if we just look at the average scores in general, like we're kind of like, hey, he's compliant, you kind of slap your hands and it's good to go. And like you said, like we trust Matt, but as a board, if someone else was in that seat and we don't have that knowledge or that innate trust that we have in him, that we know that he's always going to do the right thing, this could be problematic because then someone could actually say like, oh, well, my job is done. And then they can just kind of sweep that 36% of encouraging different points of view kind of under the rug. And so for me, I actually would be a fan of saying that maybe the average scores, that's a metric that we can look at, but I don't know if that's actually like the actual be all gauge that we say, okay, this is actually compliant. Because I would just say like, this is mostly compliant, but I don't know if it is actually fully compliant, because that, if we set like you said, like the 50% threshold, we have 2 of these that are under that. And so for me, I sit there and go, well, yeah, we should probably say that those 2 were not, if these were individual policies for each of these, right? And so that's kind of where I'm going like, actually, you know what, I think actually Jesse does have a point on that. And maybe it's more of, we just say that this one is partially compliant, and our hope and goal, just like Matt already did with this overall policy in general from last year, is just continued improvement on that.
Mr. Hunter?
I have a one question with regard to the 36%. And to Kathleen's point that we had 11% higher engagement, has that number trended downward since the inclusion of that 11% increase? Is there any way to know that?
I don't have the information with me this evening, but we can compare year by year or years to years.
Yeah, I think what Jesse is saying is very valid, actually, and I'm kind of with Rich. I'm still like, as I'm talking, I'm thinking this thing through, but I would like to see those comparisons. But I think partially compliant, I wish that was an option. Thank you.
Others? Anyone else? Okay. I'm sorry. Jesse?
Yeah, just again, I want to cite, the interpretation specifically says that 50% or more are listed as agreeing with the following statements. And then they list to me, that says that 50% agree with each statement, not 50% agree with, I'm just gonna say that I think, to me, that says 50% of people agree with each statement, and I don't think that that threshold has been met.
Matt,
If
you want to
it
respond?
were a different interpretation, I wouldn't be harping on this.
Matt, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps a note of caution for the board. When I give you percentages like this and in many other monitoring reports, they are objective facts that are referring to. These are, yes, the objective results of this survey. Surveys are very subjective exercises. If the survey had been conducted a week earlier or a week later, the numbers might be different. It's a snapshot of a moment of time The survey was conducted, I think, in April. How people were feeling during, I believe, a 2 or 3 week window of period at that time. It is inherently subjective. It is also completely anonymous, which, yes, can help some people feel better about answering, but also emboldens other kinds of comments. So even though these numbers, they're not rounded to the nearest decimal point, but they come out very precise, looking very precise, a word of caution that it's a shifting concept of staff morale and subjective perception. I completely agree. As I said in my introductory comments, we have work to do in our areas we want to continue to work on. If the board feels that the averaging of the scores is mathematically unnecessary, certainly that's your purview. One other caution. The surveys are, in addition to being very subjective, excruciatingly detailed. I'm only giving you a synopsis of some of the comments that seem to be most relevant to the policies per se. What does somebody mean when they say, encouraging different points of view? I don't know. It's an anonymous survey. I can't go back and ask them how that looked. So it's a bit of a rabbit hole, and it's a very much a building things on sand kind of rabbit hole. So tracking it over time is what I had hoped to achieve with this, and looking at it in that context, I think is also helpful. So certainly interested in seeing what the board's level of confidence is and how this information is presented.
Well, I mean, look, surveys are flawed. They have their flaws, and if we're going to use the data, we have to accept the flaws as a snapshot in time. Given all that, it may be better or it may be worse than a week or two later. So we have to accept that as flaws, and it is what it is. I just want to caution the board. If we are going to say you can only be compliant if you hit 50% or more on each and every one, that's going to radically alter the management style of the staff and the board's way of looking at this. And then we shouldn't be satisfied with just getting a snapshot. We should be only satisfied with getting each and every one of these and checking to see if it's 50%. Now, do you want to go, now that's a rabbit hole, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, frankly. So, I mean, let's figure out if you don't want this and you say, well, 1 or 2 of these didn't hit 50%, so therefore you're not compliant, you're only partially compliant. Think about the alternative, which is each and every one of these has to hit 50% before we say you're in compliance with this. That's the alternative, because that's what it's going to come back and be next year. So if you want that, then let's vote it partially compliant. But if you want, generally speaking, again, it's not, did you hit every target measure on the survey? The question is, are you compliant with 2211, the wording of it? Do we have a work environment that devalues humanity, creativity, and knowledgeable contribution? Or don't we? That's the question, not did we hit every 50% on every single one. So my caution to the board is, surveys are surveys, they have their inherent flaws, et cetera. But do we want to go down this hole where we got to hit 50% on each one of them? Now, we could say, hey, these are the results the CEO gave us, and so that's, we're only going by what he gave us, and that's what we have. I fully understand that, but if we're going to turn around and say, nah, you didn't hit 50% on these, then we got to accept the alternative, which is enforcement of 50% of each and every one. Susan, then Jesse.
Well, just to sort of speak to what you were raising, Eric, some of them have greater weight than others. For me, anyway, I feel genuinely appreciated at TheRide seems to have the most weight. The whole point to this is the treatment of staff. I feel genuinely appreciated. Having a 67% feels more important to me than I've been asked for some creative ideas, especially in a stressful time. We've just been through 2 years of unbelievable stress for staff. And that the agency operates by strong values, I put that right second. So if we're going to go down the rabbit hole, I would want to weight these things very differently. I think it's important that we recognize some of these statements speak more broadly to the policy than the others. And those two, for me, have the most weight. And if we're going to do that rabbit hole, I'd want to have a deeper dialogue about the questions on the survey, some of which aren't even here. We've heard this already. Matt pulled out some that spoke to what he thought most closely aligned to the policy. I think we're going down way too deep into the details. The attrition rate is strong. People feel strongly appreciated at the agency, and they believe the agency is operating by strong values. Those to me seem very compelling, and we're hitting all of those. So for my part, I don't think they're all equally valued. I just don't think they each have the same weight as certainly those first two on this list, plus the attrition. I don't want to lose sight of that attrition. Thank you.
Jesse?
I really do appreciate everyone's contributions to this. I mean, I do want to point out, though, the rabbit hole, I feel like, was introduced by the CEO. This is his interpretation, not mine. He said 50% or more listed as agreeing with the following statements, and he didn't meet that threshold except by averaging the score. So, like, I mean, I could see going cannot be determined because we don't find, it sounds like you maybe don't agree with his use of that metric, that you don't think he should have gone with that 50% for each statement.
No, I'm just saying if we're going to hold him to I mean, yes and no. I mean, ultimately, it's a tool, it's a method. The survey is a tool, a method to interpret whether or not we think as a board, he's creating a work environment that devalues humanity, creativity, and knowledgeable contribution. What I appreciate is something what Susan just said, which is every board member's got their own interpretation of it. We can use Matt's interpretation, which you just spoke to, of, hey, this is the metric he put in front of us, these are the metrics, this is what we've got to go with. Susan, for one, is saying, hey, I value or put greater weight on some of these than others, and these are the ones that I'm going to pay attention to judge my own interpretation of this as compliant or not. And you've got to do the same, and each board member's got to do the same. So it's kind of irrelevant whether I agree with them or not. It's really what you think. So my only question was, hey, yes, so in part, to answer your question, I'm not sure that, when a survey of 50% or more listed with each and every statement makes the difference or not, I'm not totally sure. What I don't get from this is an overall sense that we are devaluing humanity, creativity, and knowledgeable contribution, which are, let's face it, those are kind of malleable and subjective terms anyway. What is humanity? What is knowledgeable contribution, et cetera? So maybe the way we look at this is let's either throw out or shore up the wording of 2211 to make it more precise, so we don't have to go through this, right? We could do a better job with that.
Then I guess I feel like I need to make this decision based on what's in front of me, and that this is what the CEO has put out, and seeing if that I don't know that I have the position of being able to prioritize humanity, creativity, and knowledgeable contribution. They're all part of the same thing, and I guess as particularly that it seems like maybe we're not quite getting to the point of making people feel that they like their knowledgeable contribution is being valued. That that they don't feel like based on the evidence that I'm being presented with, which is all I have, I don't feel like that value is being met.
Okay. I mean, if we wanted to be more precise, we could break out some of these survey questions into actual policy goals. For instance, we could say, operate with a working environment where people feel generally unappreciated, right? That could be a one-question survey. Or where, people feel that the ATA operates by strong values, yes or no. That we could make that a one-person survey, right? And would be much more precise, and we wouldn't have to go through this debate every single time. But I mean, that's a policy debate we need to have as a board. And you're absolutely right. For right now, today, we have to vote on what's in front of us, and with the wording we have. Anyone else? And does anyone want to make a motion about the level of adoption for the monitoring report? Again, we have A in compliance, B in compliance except for items noted. C cannot be C, making reasonable progress, D, not in compliance and not making reasonable progress, or E, cannot be determined. Jesse?
I'd like to move that we accept this as B, in compliance, except as items noted, and I would like to note 2211 as partially compliant.
Is there a second for that? Brian? Any other comment? All those in favor of the motion as presented, B, in compliance except for items noted, raise your hand. That's Ryan Hunter, Jesse Miller, Rich Chang. All those opposed, raise your hand. And that's Mozak, Sims, Mahler, Alamein, and Polly. So that motion fails. Is there any other motion somebody wants to put forward? Still have to adopt it at some level. Ms. Sims?
I'd like to move that we accept the policy 2.2 treatment of staff as compliant, A.
Is there a second for that? Ms. Mozak? All those in favor of level of adoption at A, raise your hand. It's Polly, Alamein, Sims, and Mozak. And that fails. So I guess we have a push. I could. There's nothing in the rules that say we have to adopt or not adopt. So, I mean, this is a failure to adopt at any level. So I guess that goes to, by default, kind of what I was going to vote for, which is cannot be determined.
I was hoping you could elaborate on that. Do you feel that the entire policy cannot be determined, or just a policy that we've been talking about?
I don't know that I don't know that including partial survey results can help us determine it. I'm not saying the information is flawed, I'm not even flawed. I'm not even saying the grouping to get to a 50% is flawed. I just think without the entire survey, we can't make a determination.
Well, the survey.
And quite frankly, this is what I was kind of getting at, the definitions of what are humanity, creativity, knowledgeable contribution, I think weren't clearly defined, and therefore we can't make a determination. I can't.
I guess I find your arguments about like trying to parse out these particular things. I think that's a worthwhile discussion to be having. And I think I could be in agreement that I can't really determine whether or not this is compliant because we're trying to put a mathematical objective on what is a subjective idea. So I'll put forth a motion that we accept the report as incompliant with the exception of 2211, which cannot be determined.
Is there a second for that? Ms. Mozak? All in favor of the motion, the third motion we've put out there, raise your hand. That's Polly, Chang, Miller, Mahler, Hunter, and Mozak, all opposed. Sims and Alamein, and that motion does carry. Thank you for that robust discussion. We'll move on then to.
Oh, can I ask a question though?
Yeah,
So, because I find the policy trend line that's on page 12 to be extremely useful. How is this going to get indicated on there for fiscal year 22? Yeah.
I think it'll just be black, just a solid black square.
Okay. Because I mean, I really do find this really helpful for us as a board to kind of see the trends. And I mean, that was for me actually why like 2211, I'm sitting going like, well, it shows as green, but it really isn't. So I just want to make sure we're not going to drop this.
Yeah, well, we'll color it as a B, but I think it'll be helpful to note it so and actually get it out there for policy debate in one committee or another and put it out there. So make sure we don't lose sight of it.
Question,
Yeah.
I want to lose the earlier point that Kyra made, which was about the creativity. I don't quite understand, maybe because I'm still relatively new, I don't quite understand how the policy was written to encourage that element. You know, given what I understand of what the agency's work is, I don't know that, I don't understand how that sort of found its way in. And I'm intrigued that the question about works toward the mission of the agency is in a higher, like, I feel like my work contributes to the mission of the agency, that doesn't find its way in. So I'm just, at some point, maybe we could have a dialogue about how creativity was there and how we were going to be measuring that along the way. So it would help me to, for the next discussion, not for tonight.
Yeah, no, I wish I remembered how it got in there. I mean, there was discussion at the time we adopted policy governance about not losing innovation as a key element of moving forward. So, you know, we have an innovation policy in there about the CEO presenting at least once a year a report on innovative ideas, et cetera, to the board in terms of, you know, the CEO shall not lose sight of, you know, kind of staying innovative, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there was a discussion at the board at the time of not losing, of becoming stale, not losing creativity. I think that's generally how we tried to work some of it in there. But yeah, I mean, if somebody says, you know, the AATA encourages different points of view, and they say no, what they might mean is, well, they didn't adopt my point of view, right? I mean, I got my point of view out there, but nobody adopted it, so, you know, I'm going to say no to that, right? That could be a very, to Matt's point, a very subjective view. You know, you didn't encourage me, you kind of said no to me. So I don't know if it's hard to know what people mean by creativity again. So maybe again, I think that's something maybe we look at in terms of those malleable, very easily misinterpreted words that we could probably eliminate and be a little more statutory-esque, if you will, about our writing and drafting. Right. And I guess for the final time, we'll go to Brian Smith for the Q3 quarterly service report. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would point that the service report was in the packet. If anybody has any questions, would be happy to answer them. Ridership has remained stable over this last quarter, and we are looking forward to it growing as the students come back. And we have
like the swallows of Capistrano.
That's right. The students have returned, and with our service levels.
Am I the only one who remembers that? Okay. The swallows of Capistrano. That's probably the most famous line Mr. Smith has had since he's been with us. Does anybody else remember that? Am I the only one? All right. Okay.
I tried to get more poetic when I was early on. I wanted to be memorable. So with the students coming back, but also returning to full service, would like to just give a shout out to our operators and our mechanics and all of the staff that make that happen every day. We have returned back to full service with the exception of one bus on the 62 and one bus on the 68. Those are both planned to come back, one in late August and one in early September. But we have fielded the rest of our service, even though we keep having these little mini spikes in COVID cases and in exposures and all of the things. along with people trying to take vacations, it being summer. So it has not been without sacrifice and a lot of hard work and juggling. And I am proud of the division for being able to bring it back, even as we continue to seek out operators and mechanics. A little pitch there if anybody knows anyone, and would be happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Any questions on the Kyra?
Brian, one question. This graph for ridership complaints, there's a note that there's been a steep rise in valid complaints. Is there some sort of common theme from these complaints?
So I'll have to confess that I don't know off the top of my head, but can do some research and get back to you. I believe at one point over the summer when we had a reduced level of service, much of the complaints were about we weren't able to reduce the service in a way that, instead of every 15 minutes, we came every half an hour. It was 15, 15, 45, 15, 20, and so much of the complaints came with there not being a predictable schedule. But I'll have to get back to you on the exact answer if it's not that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that'd just be helpful for us and staff to know if there's something in particular that we can work on, if there's a common theme for these valid complaints, given the sharp increase. Thanks, Brian.
Kathleen?
So under fixed route ridership and cost, I wanted to say, wow. And why I'm saying wow is if you look at 2019 history and you look at the history of ridership pre-pandemic, summer is always takes a dive. Ridership decreases because school is out and things like that. People are going on vacation. But if you look at our quarters this year, our summer quarter is the same as the first and second quarter. And so to me, that is a win. That means that, to me, I read that as ridership is up because we didn't see that dive that we see normally. And so whatever we're doing right, I think we should keep doing it.
Others, comments or questions? Okay, Jesse?
I was a little bit surprised to see the decrease in utilization of TheRide East over last year, but was that a surprise to you, or was that just a result of bringing fixed routes back online that took up that ridership, or is there something? It was something like half the rides, and so it just kind of seemed notable to me, but maybe you had some better context for it.
So it did show about a third drop, about a 35% drop in ridership. And I would attribute that to the reestablishment of the 45 and the 46. Although I will comment that we continue to get feedback from operators and the public about whether or not those routes will return to their previous runs, and that's something that I know Forrest is looking at how best to serve those areas that previously didn't have a huge ridership, and how we can make sure everything connects together from a mobility perspective.
Thank you. And hey, congratulations on beating the national average in ridership.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Mike?
Brian, I had a question about your chart that is TheRide, paratransit ridership and costs. The the ridership graph right under that, and specifically about Gold Ride. It's returned, but you can barely even see it. What does that tell you about the future of Gold Ride?
So that that is actually one of the items that I owe Matt as a tie-up before September 9th. And I would expect that in governance and in service and finance, you'll have a staff recommendation for Gold Ride going into the next year. It is very low utilization for a fair amount of expense.
Okay, so we'll be talking about that soon,
Yes, sir.
but certainly you need to give your recommendation to Matt first.
Yes.
That's fine.
Anyone else? All right, thank you, Brian. And we'll move on then to the Q3 financial report, and I think Ms. Reed will take us through it.
Thank you. The Q3 financial statement is in your packet. There are a few key points that I'll note. As you look at the financial statement, the income statement, you'll see that we are trending favorable to budget on expenses and unfavorable on revenues. But the net impact of all of that is that we're trending on budget, and we are trending on plan for the capital reserve transfer for the end of the year. So the savings that we're seeing overall in expense, one major line item that kind of stands out is the purchase transportation. And what we've seen there is a decline in demand related to the reduced ridership, some of what we were just speaking of with the TheRide and the Gold Ride. So what we're seeing is lower expenses in both of those areas related to that. Because expenses are lower, we don't have to use as much federal pandemic relief fund for revenue. So that's a big decrease in the revenue that we're seeing up at the top, as well as federal operating assistance. As you might recall, federal operating assistance is a percentage of eligible expenses. So anytime we see a decrease in an eligible expense, which these would qualify for of like $1, then we also get 30 cents less revenue from the state. So it's 29 to 30% is roughly the match on that. So those are the areas where you're seeing a little bit of decrease in the revenue, and that's why it kind of nets out in the end, because they're correlated. Also on the revenue side, we're seeing some softness on the passenger fare and contract revenue, and that's related to the reduced or the lag in the recovery of ridership compared to what we had planned last year and budgeted. And you'll hear some of these trends in the budget presentation I'm about to give, but this is consistent with some of the projections that we're going forward with for fiscal year 23 as well. Moving through the report and just trying to hit the highlights for you. Another really important point here is that our net position stays strong. We continue to meet or exceed our operating reserve balance target. That's the top of the balance sheet statement. So that's good. Our reserves are strong and in line with what we've been projecting. If you move further down the page into the investment summary, I'd like to note that you'll see that the strategy that we were employing earlier this year of holding off on some of those investments because the interest rates were soft are starting to pay off. We're now able to invest in very conservative treasury bonds, agency bonds and treasury notes at a little bit longer term, of course, managing to cash flow needs. And you can see that the interest rates that we're receiving now are around 3%, which is significantly higher than anything we would have gotten several months ago. So that was a strategy that we were working through earlier this spring, just kind of waiting to see if those interest rates were rising while keeping that cash in the sweep account that we talked about earlier this year. It was fully insured the whole time. And as soon as those interest rates started to go up and we can manage our longer term cash flow, we started making more significant investments in those instruments. That concludes the highlights of the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the report.
Questions about the Q3 financial report? Anybody? Okay. Oh, there's a hand. Mike, go ahead.
Now, first of all, I really have a couple of comments. Certainly our finances are very strong, as Dina pointed out. We should feel comfortable about that. And what she has done in terms of on the investment side, which she described, is very wise. It's still very conservative, and we're getting a whole lot better interest rate than we did before. So that's a real positive. One thing, though, that is kind of masked that you can't see just by looking at the financial report is but she of course mentioned it, and nobody's hiding it, is the fact that ridership is not gotten to where we expected it to be when the budget was put together. That isn't necessarily hurt us in the short term on the bottom line. In fact, depending on where it is, like TheRide is so expensive to provide, it might even help us on the bottom line. But it's really not good for the agency. It's really bad for the agency. Our most important metric, other than financially that we don't go out of business, is, and we will go out of business if we don't have the ridership. And I just want to again reemphasize how important ridership is. And I know that nobody is ignoring it, but it has to get better. And as Dina said, and I'm very pleased to see all the ridership information in next year's budget. But I just wanted to point that out, that is a weakness that you don't really see just by looking at the financial numbers. But I do have one question for you, Dina, that maybe I'd overlooked in the past, and maybe I'm just not seeing something correctly. And that's on the investment summary page over on the right-hand side. The statement is third quarter 22 investment loss year to date is $141,000. What does that refer to? I don't know anything about an investment loss.
Yeah, I think I'll have to follow up with you on that. I didn't actually notice that, and I'm not aware that we've had a loss either.
Yeah, I was suspecting.
It's not showing up in the statement, so it's an offhanded comment that maybe didn't get removed, but I'll check it.
And I didn't notice it before if it was on here before, but I sure noticed it here.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments on the Q3 report? And I echo what Mike said about the ridership. I mean, it shows up in the revenue column, obviously, but it's masked because the expenses also went down in a corresponding way. So, but yes, we'd rather have more ridership and hence more expense to carry those riders along. Anybody else? If not, we'll move to section 4, strategy and operational updates. 4.1, propulsion timeline, and I'll give it to Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really, this is a warm-up for the main event, which is, of course, Ms. Reed's presentation of the budget. I want to provide just a piece of context as we go into this. And there is a Gantt chart available on page 47 of the packet. I wanted to take a moment and explain the emerging process for discussing alternative propulsion technologies and the implications for our capital budget. So to be clear, no decisions today. I'm not going to be introducing any mechanical or engineering discussions. It's just the feedback on this process, and I'm happy to take feedback from board members tonight or anytime, frankly, before October. In October, I'm going to be releasing to you a draft report on propulsion technology, and we're going to have a retreat on the subject. That report is not going to make any recommendations. It's background research on the state of the technology, and that will kick off what I expect to be multiple months of discussion. I'm roughly targeting any sort of decision between February and April, but it is certainly not going to occur immediately. We have a bit of a sequencing challenge here. Our budget for this year, including the capital budget, has to be approved before October, and we're not even going to start talking about this potentially large capital expense until after that point. So I want to reconcile that or acknowledge that when Ms. Reed talks about capital, she'll probably make passing comment to a placeholder for alternative propulsion. Essentially, we've penciled in an item, a line item, a category with zeros in the budget. We're not asking you to approve any expenditures for alternative propulsion in September, but we are sort of signaling that, this is going to have to be discussed. Our intent is to bring it to you, like I say, in October, begin several, probably board meetings of discussion. And then probably in February, bring you a recommendation from myself, as we did with the long-range plan, that this is the staff's technical recommendation, and then the board can discuss and amend or adopt that recommendation. Not only of should we do a propulsion technology, what type of technology might make more sense, and how would we pay for it? And at that point, I'll give you a recommendation of how we would accommodate both those costs and the long-range plan costs in the capital budget. That's really going to be the kickoff discussion for what are our priorities, frankly? Which of these projects are of greater importance to us and to the board? We can amend our capital budget off cycle, and that is what I think we may do. So the board will ultimately have final decision on this matter, although propulsion is a very meansy issue in policy governance parlance. The capital budget implication is very large. I will need your authorization of a capital budget. I would probably bring that forward as a capital budget amendment. We probably will not be able to afford to do anything in this space without grants. I need your authorization to submit grant applications. And the federal government also is now requiring us to have a transition plan approved by a board for these propulsion discussions. So all three of those things will constitute your approval mechanism, and that will happen, if it happens, probably early, middle of next year. So Dina will be presenting a budget with a placeholder of 0 in here because we need to get something approved before October. And then as we go forward into fiscal year 2023, immediately starting in October, we will have this discussion teed up. And then exactly how you will approve it is fairly clear, as I've outlined. So this Gantt chart attempts to sort of outline the key steps that are going on there. I do anticipate some public discussions after we've introduced the idea with you. I know we have many stakeholders in this community that are, shall I say, keenly interested in the subject, and I know I need to engage with them and perhaps the general public. Thinking back to a discussion we just had, I have made a personal promise to the mechanics of our agency that no decision would be tabled by me to you until I've had a chance to discuss this with them. That's an example of the kind of thing that I think staff want to have meaningful input in. And I think that's very reasonable. The mechanics will be more affected by that decision than any other group of staff. But that involvement will also take time. The draft report is a very dense 170-page technical thing, and I have a feeling the mechanics are going to want to go line by line through it. So that's an example of kind of the trade-off there. So nevertheless, I'm happy to take feedback on this process and tonight, Mr. Chair, or anytime over the next several weeks or into October.
Just for at least my education, this transition plan that the federal government is requiring, is that formulaic or any way, or does that just mean a date sometime in the future? I mean, how loose or tight is that?
It's fairly loose, except for the parts that are tight. Bear with me. The federal government so we're very lucky in the US that the federal government has many generous grant programs, competitive grant programs that we can tap as a transit agency. They attach strings to that money. What they have done is to attach strings to a grant program called Bus and Bus Facilities. This is the grant program that we would need to tap to build a garage or a terminal. And they have said we cannot apply for that until we have a documented plan for how we are going to transition to zero emissions propulsion. So if you're looking for a connection between a bus facility and propulsion, there is not one. But whoever cuts the checks gets to make the rules, and that's the rule they made. So we have a vested interest in having this discussion. I'm not saying that you will find an acceptable decision here. I hope to give you one, but this does motivate us, I guess I should say. What's in the transition plan is somewhat formulaic, but pretty loose. And no, there is no timeline or deadline contingent on us as to when the transition must be completed. I think that was perhaps the heart of your question. We are not at this time dealing with a federal mandate that we must transition our propulsion systems by a certain date. We do see those in California. They've said 2040. A lot of my counterparts in California are all planning to retire in 2039. That's another story. But we do not have that yet in Michigan nor through the federal government. But one of the things I know I will need to bring to your attention is the potential for that kind of thing as a federal mandate. And if nothing else, we have this complicated string attached to a very necessary grant program. So we'll have to sort all that out.
Okay. Well, just so I'm clear, once you, and kind of my bottom line of my question was if you submit a grant application, you don't have to put a timeline in your own grant, knowing there's no federal mandate, but we don't have to say, we'll get there in 10 years, we'll get there in 12 years. Not there's a date out there, but once we get the money, we have 10 years to transition, or we have 12 years to transition. There's nothing like that.
My understanding, and I need to do a little more research, is that the transition plan is a separate document from your grant application, but it would be an attachment. I do think they want to see a deadline, a non-binding voluntary deadline from us about when we would see the transition being completed. It can't be binding because there are so many risks and unknowns in that kind of a technology adoption that they can't really hold us to it. Plus, they're the ones who would have to provide the money for it. So really, our ability to do it is largely dependent on them ponying up the cash. So we will probably need to give them some sort of deadline, but it's a deadline that we find acceptable.
Anybody else? Others? Okay. We'll move on then to, oh, I'm sorry. Mike, go ahead. Must be on a time delay or something with Mike.
Well, yeah, just one quick question, Matt. I was a little confused by your Gantt chart specific, but I think you covered it in your words, but I just wanted to be sure. I was confused by the line number 4, complete report, spread over 3 months, July, August, September. To me, a complete report is a completed report that the board will be getting at a particular time. And I would suspect that maybe the process milestone yellow dot should be there someplace. And anyway, I'm curious when the board will see this report.
Thank you, Mike. You are correct. Item task 4 should probably read develop report. It is in final draft stage now. Our consultant has taken feedback on a large draft already. They're writing it. They're going to give me their final on August the 26th. My intent is to work with them to make sure it's in a reasonably final draft state, then begin a soft rollout with my mechanics. I think they're the first group that I need to really talk with there. You are the next audience. I would be releasing it to you as part of your October retreat. Around the same time, my intent is to publicly release that document. Again, it does not present a recommendation of anything we should do. I intentionally structured it that way. It is just background research on the state of the various technologies and the pros and cons. We do have many members of this community who are very interested in our decisions in this area, and I want to make sure that we can engage them with a common set of facts. So that's my intent for that document. So first, soft launch with staff in September, then to you for your October retreat, and then the general public.
And Matt, it's certainly clear in here what that report is going to be. It's just, as you said, facts that came to you from the consultant and other parties. And I presume we will be getting that report prior to the retreat so that we'll have it time to digest.
Oh, yes. I'm not going to give you a document like this a week in advance. As soon as I've made sure I don't see any glaring typos, I'll probably be sending it to you as well. We're trying to make it as readable and accessible as possible, but it does delve into quite a bit of engineering to talk about. But I think you will find it accessible. So yes, my intent is to give it to you in probably September.
Great, thanks, Matt.
Anyone else? If not, we'll move on then to our budget presentation for the evening. And Ms. Reed has already taken the podium. And we'll turn it over to her for the preliminary budget presentation. So go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to get up here and get moving in the sake of time. So I'll try to, I have a 30-slide presentation. I'll try to get through it fairly quickly. It's much more high level than what is presented in your board packet. In your board packet, you have a complete draft budget book to review. There's a lot of extra additional information, and I'm happy to answer any questions about anything in that book now or anytime throughout the next month until we get to the budget that I'll be presenting next month for your approval. So I'll get started. Our agenda tonight is to talk, just to give you a general budget introduction with a timeline to kind of, put us in line with where we're at today, give a little bit of a budget overview and some draft budget highlights, operating and capital. The budget timeline has not changed from what I presented before, and I only present it today to just show you where we're at. It is August 18th. What we've done so far is we have prepared two budgets that you've seen. We had an overview, now we have a draft budget. We have had a public meeting. Thank you, Mr. Carpenter, for taking care of that while I was out a couple of weeks ago. We have presented, so we've given the public time to review it. Staff has reviewed it at a very high level, as well as meetings with managers have been taking place. We're still in a fairly developmental phase, although now in the draft budget, we have a lot more structure. We have incorporated information from the millage that we'll talk about here shortly, and also initiatives that were not in there before. So that's kind of where we're at. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll be revisiting the key assumptions. Tonight, we have an official public hearing where the public can talk to us about excuse me, about our budget. And we will incorporate comments from the board as well as comments from the public and into our changes and assumptions and come to you with a final recommendation in just over a month. So we'll be busy. Just want to make a point here that we do focus on making sure that our budget advances board ends. Everything that we do at TheRide, budget and everything else, really goes to the board ends. And so in preparation of this, the budget process actually starts well before we actually start putting numbers to the budget. We start with a strategic look at where things have been, how things are going, and what the climate looks like, what the economic conditions are. We look at the board ends, we make sure that we're thinking about a plan of how we're going to execute and advance that vision. This is just gives some symbols. I'm going to use these throughout the presentation to just kind of keep us grounded. to the fact that everything that we're doing, all the money that we're spending somehow goes back to advance these ends. Then we move into a next phase where we do a corporate business plan, which I'm sure that you have all seen. Management provides initiatives associated with that, with the business plan priorities, and then those in turn get evaluated to go into the budget. This year, our business plan priorities are retain and attract ridership, implement the long-range plan, and agency-wide continuous improvements. So as we move through the budget, I'll reference initiatives that are in line with our business plan priorities. And our budget always follows best practices and policies. So I'm not going to go through these today, but we follow GAP. We follow any policy that you have related to budgeting. We use sound financial practices. We have strategic planning, as I just mentioned. We have multi-year planning, and I'll show you an example of that as we move forward as well. Some key messages this year is we're really focused on what's happening to inflation or with inflation and how that's impacting us. Those things are putting pressure on our budget, as well as changes with the ridership. We're watching that closely, as Mike said, key indicator of a lot of different areas of our budget, both revenue and expense. But most importantly, we seek to maintain transportation services and to continue to recover from the pandemic. So the pandemic is clearly still not over. We are in a more stable position to understand, for the most part, what some of the impacts of the pandemic are on our operating budget. And so we've been able to make some fine tuning this year in the 23 budget, and that resulted in some variances that you'll see. We're focused on plan design and funding our capital plan. We're managing the mix of inflation. We're focused on the challenging labor market that's impacted things this year and will continue to impact things next year. We're also focused on ridership recovery and our progress on initiatives that further the board's ends, as I just mentioned. Most importantly, we are financially stable. We have a balanced FY23 draft budget. We expect to present a balanced budget to you next month as well. So I'm going to go through the draft budget at a very high level. First of all, just some highlights. Operating expenses are flat, which might be counterintuitive to the idea that we keep talking about inflation. So I'll talk about that as we move a little bit through. But the good news is we're able to manage those expenses and actually incorporate initiatives and even accelerate some millage items into this fiscal year that are directly aligned to the board's ends. And those are only one-year impacts. With all of those things included, we're still looking at a flat expense budget. We are continuing to restore fixed route services to full levels, so the budget incorporates that. We are also leveraging $17.3 million of federal relief funds. That's not a new story. We're still going to do that through FY 2023 and 24. And in the end of this year, with the draft budget, barring any adjustments, which there will be some, but we expect to have somewhere in the range of $11.8 million as a surplus of local funds to be placed into the capital reserve, which is consistent with what we've been projecting. And we'll continue to fund that reserve as we've projected in the past. On the capital side, we're funding fleet and facility capital investments at $14 million. There's about $16.8 million total in FY23 expected to be spent on capital projects, and $14 million of it is to take care of our fleet at our facilities. We also have planning and design funding for the YTC, and the BTC has been postponed a little bit to 2024 to focus on the YTC. We're still looking at timing in the capital plan, so there might be a few changes to some timing of different things in the capital plan between 23 and 24 as we continue to progress through the budget process. We also incorporated longer-term expansion projects related to the long-range plan. Most of those larger projects are further out, but we do have some planning and design funding in the near term, and including FY23. So now I'll move in a little bit into the operating budget. Best story I get to tell tonight is our projection. As we've talked about earlier, and for ever since I've been here, we had an operating deficit, and we're fortunate that we were able to put forth a millage opportunity for the voters, and they approved it. We've incorporated the impacts of the millage into the budget and financial forecast. It's in more detailed fashion in your packet, but for now, tonight, I just want to show you that you imagine how excited I was when I got to lay all these numbers in, and in the end, in 2030, fifth year of the millage, revenues expenses are almost equal, just a little bit of a surplus, which is exactly where we would want to see it. It demonstrates that when we implement everything that we said in the millage, that we will be financially stable in year 5. So what that indicates is, as long as we manage expenses and we take care of the funding that we have, in year 5, we would not need necessarily to increase the mill rate to maintain what we're already committed to. And that's a very important stability point I wanted to make today. You'll also note that the gap really and the impacts of the millage really don't start until fiscal year 25. That's because the millage doesn't, as we've said before, the millage doesn't actually go into effect until 2024. And the first revenue we receive from that will be in July of 2024, which will really start to fund things at the end of 2024. And the full year effect of that is in 2025. Looks like there's a little bit of a surplus here. Another thing I need to note is that when our budget goes up significantly based on the increased cost of the additional services that we're going to implement, we will have to fund a reserve. We'll have to increase our operating reserve to maintain our operating reserve balance. So some of that surplus that you see will actually be to fund that requirement that we have to maintain financial stability in our reserves. But most importantly, that outlook is stable through the projection period, and we're really proud to present that to you today. This is just a graph of 10 years of operating expenses. I thought it would be helpful to present just the context of where we've been in terms of operating expenses. You can see that in 22, we had quite an increase in expenses, but also remember that 2020 and 2021 decreased significantly, and that was because of the pandemic. So now we're recovering. Additional costs came into the budget in 2022. That orange part there, that purchase transportation, we talked about that a lot last year. We are seeing that actually come down a little bit. Unfortunately, that's a result of the lag of the ridership growth with demand for A-Ride and Gold Ride. So it's a good story, bad story. Expenses are going down, but it's really a result of just a reduced demand compared to what we projected. So we're really expecting and hoping that that goes up in the future. But that new A-Ride contract that we entered into last year has been fully negotiated now and executed, and we have a stable 4-year contract with our A-Ride contractor with a little bit of reduction in proposed cost through the negotiation process. So I feel very pleased to report that that's a very important part of our service that is stable and funded. Summary of expenses shows what I mentioned earlier, that the operating expenses are essentially flat. You'll see that salaries, wages, and benefits are going up. Purchase transportation is coming down. That's a result of the reduction in demand for A-Ride and Gold Ride services. So that's actually kind of a good thing in the expense side, but there's the flip side to it. Fuel, materials, and supplies is something we're going to talk about in a little more detail. That's going up as a result of the fuel costs that we've all heard about. Inflationary factors are real, and we're addressing those in the budget as well. This is how we're kind of balancing things out. We have savings, we have costs, and I just have some key categories here, key factors impacting operating expenses. We'll talk a little bit about, in more detail, some of those budget cost items, because those are the only drivers really that are increasing costs in our budget. But we do have offsetting savings, and that's why you're kind of seeing this balance out. The savings that we're seeing this year in terms of the predictability of the pandemic, we're able to take out expenses that we budgeted for before, because we were able to kind of right size what we think we need going forward, and we're comfortable with that now. Whereas last year, maybe we had a little bit more contingency in there because we just weren't certain what was going to happen and how we might have to deal with that. We also have stabilized insurance costs, which was a topic last year of growth. The market has stabilized, and that's a very positive thing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, reduced costs from lower demand. Let's talk a little bit about fuel costs. As I mentioned in the Finance Committee meeting, fuel costs are definitely going up. We build the budget based on a rate volume. So we look at projections of what we think fuel is going to be on a price per gallon. We know how many gallons we use. We have projections for that. Just want to share with you that our current FY 2023 budget rate for fuel is 401. That is consistent with the US DOT's projection, which essentially this week they put out something that just said they were estimating around 414. I'm not sure if we're going to increase that. We do generally not, we're going to look at how much we trend. Like, do we actually trend exactly with that metric? Or do we actually get our fuel a little bit cheaper than that? And so maybe we can soften it up. But if you look at where we've been this year, that's what this graph is. It shows you where we've been this whole year in terms of the volatility of fuel prices. And you can see that the FY 2023 budget line is kind of in the middle, right? So what we did was we looked at not only what the DOT said, but we looked at what we've paid over the past year and said, what do we think is reasonable amount of risk to take in the budget? And we're budgeting 401 for fuel. All in all, by doing that and adjusting our increase in volume just slightly based on consumption and expected transportation service, we're expecting a 1.3 increase in diesel fuel and gasoline costs. So the line item that we saw earlier didn't go up by quite 1.3 because there are offsetting savings in there, but this is the pure cost of what we expect fuel to go up next year. We're going to continue to evaluate these assumptions.
Dina, real quick, do we do fuel purchases on contracts still? I mean, in terms of a futures contract or something?
It's not a futures contract, no.
Okay, but just by contract,
Yeah,
flat?
yes, we have
Okay.
yep, we have a contract. That's a risk I'll point out shortly. Another key component of our budget, and the most important and biggest percentage of our operating budget, is based on staff salaries, wages, and benefits. So I just want to point out here that what we presented before for full-time employees showed that we were going to be flat year over year with full-time employees, which was good management of our full-time employee. But we did still see increases based on the new union contract and administration assumptions. There was no increase in budgeted staff FTEs, but now we've included 5 new FTEs, and I want to talk just for a second about that. The 5 staff FTEs that we've included in the FY23 budget are part of the millage. So these FTEs are funded over the long term through the millage proposal that was approved in August. What we're doing here is we're adding some additional expense in the short term to staff up, try to meet some really high level initiatives that we've been hearing about at the YTC. We're also trying to make sure that we're staffed properly to get ready for these increases that we're going to see in service. So we've got a couple of on-road supervisors and 1 administrative staff. You may remember that we had 9 approved FTE positions in the millage, and right now we're only recommending that we're going to accelerate 5. And we're bridging that gap with savings on the expense side or federal pandemic relief funds. But these assumptions are already included in all the budget numbers I'm sharing with you this evening. Salaries, wages, and benefits are going up by 4.2%, which is a result of incorporating the first year impact of our union agreements that were just negotiated this year, and also a 4% increase for administrative salaries and wages. So as we talked about just a few minutes ago, there were some corporate business priorities that we were focused on. They are listed here again, but this time I'm sharing with you some of the key initiatives that are included in the budget. So all of these initiatives are funded in the draft budget that I've prepared for you today. We're looking to provide full transportation services, as I've said. We have a rebuild ridership campaign. We have mobile payment and text my bus campaigns. So what we're really looking to do here is focus on ridership. Not only we want to retain the ridership we have, we want to attract new ridership. We know that that's critical to long-term success of our agency. And so we're really focused on what can we do to make that better. And these are some of the things we're going to do. We're also working towards a redesign for printed ride guides. that we expect to be finished next year. And as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we want to staff the YTC with two customer service agents. Also, in terms of implementing the long-range plan, obviously it's a long-range plan. There's a lot to do, and a lot of that really results in capital. But there are some operating budget components to that, and that is new service campaigns. So we're going to really let people know what we're going to be doing. Even though the new service doesn't go in until 2024, there's going to be some campaign work, some things that are going to be done this year to get that message out well ahead of when the service actually gets implemented, so we can build excitement around it and hopefully really see a big impact when we expand that service. Also, we're also going to advertise our current services, so it's not just for the new service, but also for current services to try to get people interested if they're not already, or just more informed about how to use our service. Also, we're going to perform an equity analysis and a Title VI program update, and those are required for elements of the long-range plan, but they are operating expenses. Agency-wide continuous improvements. Big focus this year, as Matt mentioned earlier, is kind of taking we're going to want to take a little bit of a breather, refocus on what our highest priorities are. And something we can do to kind of help relieve burden on staff is focus on technology and how we can leverage that to improve processes and procedures, making it less burdensome for staff. So we have budgeted for an IT needs assessment organization-wide. And we had an IT needs assessment that will be evaluated before we actually go forward with the new IT needs assessment to make sure we're not repeating anything. But a lot of things have changed in the agency, and we know that we need to look at our financial system. We're currently implementing new payroll systems now. So we've got to upgrade some systems that we have and maybe replace some systems that we have. And we want to make sure we do that strategically and planning for integration for everything and a timeline, a really good timeline. So it's kind of like the long range plan, only it's the administrative and technology improvements that we also need to plan. Maybe not 30 years, but we definitely need a 5-year technology plan that we can start to execute on. Additionally, we've talked a little bit about this. It's very important that we maintain training for our staff. One way to relieve pressure and improve engagement with staff is to make sure that they're trained, they have the tools that they need, and that we can recruit. So we're really focused on training. We've increased the training budget by a couple $100,000 this year. We have specific initiatives related to that. It's not just a ballpark number. We have specific initiatives that we want to do with specific kinds of training. One of them is leadership training. Another one is EAM training, which is our asset management system. And there are operations training too. So we have several different kinds of training incorporated in that. We're going to do a diversity, equity, and inclusion review. And we're going to look at our facilities workspace and make some improvements. We're already starting that this year. We're painting, we're putting in new carpet. We're doing things to make our workspace better and more efficient. This particular initiative is more focused on the tool room. So we're looking at all areas of our workforce and making sure that we're upgrading things as need be to make them more efficient and secure. That's kind of the summary I have for expenses. I'll take if anybody has any questions, we can ask at the end, but I also want to just take a pause. I'm doing a lot of talking, so maybe a quick pause if anybody has any questions about anything I presented so far. Okay. All right.
Justin, go ahead.
With the YTC customer service reps, what's the timeline, do you think? I know that another part of it was improving the facilities, like getting some new furniture and things. So I was wondering what the timeline that you were aiming for with having those people in place.
Well, I can't say for sure how long it will take to recruit, but we're doing very well in recruitment right now. And I think the idea is to try to strike while the iron's hot in terms of the recruitment efforts that we've had and the success that we have in that area. So I would assume that we would try, I know we're going to try and fill those positions as soon as possible. And as soon as the budget gets approved and we have the funding in place. But like I said, I think we're already starting to recruit for that. and seeing some good results. So we want to take advantage of that as soon as possible. I don't know if, Matt, there's anything you'd like to add to that?
Brian has given me some intriguing options. If the board supports the idea of, I call, fast tracking these millage positions, two of which are the YTC staff, we could go ahead and hire them this calendar year. So October, November, something like that. House them in the Donka Bay Operations Center, training, phone lines, office space, while the YTC itself undergoes whatever renovations we need in the space. I don't want to put a firm number on it because we haven't yet
This would be a goal.
had anybody to really go into the YTC and nail down what the costs or exactly how long it'll take. I've gotten burned a little bit on supply chain issues recently, so I don't want to make any assumptions about cabinetry or chairs. But I would love to get those folks into that facility as soon as possible. I would like to see it, January, March, somewhere in that space.
Thank you. I definitely won't hold you to that. I very much understand supply chain issues and recruiting issues, so, but thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll talk a little bit about revenues. As I did with expenses, I always think it's good to kind of get a bigger picture look at where we've been. You can see that historical operating revenues are growing. They went down in 2020 as a result of the pandemic and up in 2021 due to the pandemic relief funds. That's the green, by the way. So in terms of the color coding here, the blues are property taxes, passenger fares, purchase of services, things that we get from the services directly. The grays are other forms of revenues like state operating assistance, federal operating assistance, and so on. I put the CARES Act, SRIS, and ARP as green because that's a different source of funding, and that funding does run out as we've been talking about. So I'm kind of keeping that as a separate thing, even though it is federal pandemic relief funds. I wanted it to kind of stand out so you could see the impact that it has on our budget. Budgeted revenues are largely flat, going down just a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, that's really a result of the expenses and the change in the way we use expenses. So you can see pandemic relief revenues are going down. That's a result of expenses going slightly down and the eligible expenses that we would use that for. But we're using it to the full extent of $17.3 million that we could for eligible operating expenses. And just looking ahead, we will have some more of those pandemic relief fund revenues available in fiscal year 2024, but they will run out in 2024. So we're using them to the full extent possible as we have been. No strategy change there. You can see passenger fares are slightly down budget to budget, and that's a result of our ridership projections lagging, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'm not going to go through every line here, but I wanted to point out some of those key impacts to the budget. Local property tax revenues is such a big source of our revenue. I just wanted to note that, property tax revenues have been going up very significantly, but their average is about just over 3% when you average out over a longer period of time. We are assuming that property tax revenues in the budget will go up 3%, but it's 3% year over year. So we don't build budget to budget necessarily. We look at what we got this year and we add 3%, and that's how we built the budget here. In terms of state operating assistance, I mentioned earlier, we assume that to be 29%. It often comes in right around 29, maybe 30%, but to start out, we're assuming 29%, so we're not overreaching on that. And as I mentioned earlier, all eligible expenses will be reimbursed with CARES Act and SRIS funds to the extent possible, and potentially ARP. We're going to be done with our CARES Act money, so I probably should update that, but it's pandemic relief funds. Ridership forecast for next year is 69% of FY 2019 ridership. That is a very similar number to what we presented last year of what we expected this year to be. And what we're seeing is that there's just a little bit of a lag. We are seeing the recovery. It's not as fast as we would like, But for budget, the most important thing is that we're conservative in our projections, make, reasonably conservative, not overshooting, because that drives, budgeting that's not easy to, or that we can't accomplish. So we want to make sure we're being as realistic as possible while not being too aggressive. So you can see really that what we're expecting in '23 is similar, is really closer to what we originally expected for '22. So the timeline really just kind of moves by a year. The growth assumptions have pretty much stayed the same from '23 and beyond. But again, we were hoping and really hoping we'd see that 69% in this year, but we're not. So we're going to shoot for it again next year. We've got some, like I mentioned before, a proactive approach to try to make that happen, or maybe even exceed it. Here's a graph just kind of showing the difference between '22 and '23. I thought it's always helpful to kind of ground ourselves to what our last projection was. That yellow line is what we projected last year, and the blue line is what we're projecting this year. So you can see the kind of gap and the delay and how that plays out. In summary, we have opportunities and risks in the budget, which I want to make sure are communicated to you. We do have the opportunities are that we are able to manage inflationary pressures. Part of those inflationary pressures are managed because we have contracts in place. Some of those contracts were in place before this year. So we're benefiting from that because they're multi-year contracts and they have caps and things like that. One thing that we're going to watch as we move down into the risk section is we're able to manage those this year partly through that. But as those contracts start to expire and we have to start to go out to bid on new contracts, that's where those inflationary pressures might come into play. Any expectation of that is already included in the '23 budget to the extent that we know. But we don't always know what those will be, and so we have assumptions accordingly. Another opportunity is that ridership recovery will continue. We do believe it will, as I've said before, and we're anticipating that in our projections. We also are really focused on moving forward, moving the organization forward. The pandemic has really been a big setback for us, but it's time for us to kind of regroup. We have a long-range plan, we have a strong team, we have ridership recovery, and now we want to, put initiatives in place to be more proactive in growing ridership and taking care of things, our staff, training, development, and things like that to make us more efficient. So we will continue to move forward with the initiatives. Risks, fair revenues will take a little bit longer than we'd like to recover. State property laws and federal funding are always concerns. We don't have direct control over that, but we don't see any immediate concerns that I would that I have to share. If anything comes to my attention, I would certainly share that with you as I know. But right now, there's nothing specific. It's just kind of a general underlying risk that we have as an environment that we have. We also have, materials and costs, like I mentioned, may rise as contracts expire. Draft budget is balanced, and we have a surplus of local funds of $11.8 million, and the millage passed in August provides stability for the future. That concludes the high-level summary of the operating budget. I can take more questions or continue on the capital budget.
Just one question from me. Is the 11.8 surplus that we're projecting an opportunity to either redirect or conserve on some of the, either holding back or redirecting some of the federal relief money? Or is that an opportunity maybe to pull forward some of the, is that surplus? I mean, if we're not redirecting it to reserves, is that an opportunity to pull forward? I know this is kind of an operational over decision, so this is probably for yourself and Mr. Carpenter and others, but is there an opportunity there to pull forward some of the long-range plan projects or services that we might otherwise hold back, et cetera, et cetera? So I just wanted to put that out there for future consideration for the.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you for asking that. First, I will just say, we're moving forward so far in the budget process with the assumption that the board wanted to meet targets related to what we had communicated before in terms of creating capital reserve. So we're doing our best to manage expenses given whatever revenues we think we're going to get, to make sure that even with the initiatives we want to do, we're staying around a $12 million surplus this year so that we can direct that into the capital reserve to fund the long-range plan. Any additional expenses that we want to put in our budget, any additional initiatives, any more pull ahead items from the millage, that's an option. Those are options for us to consider. If we do that, that's exactly what will happen. The $11.8 million will go down. Almost dollar for dollar, it depends. We get state operating assistance, don't forget, on additional operating expenses. So if it's an operating expense that's coming into the budget, we'll get 29%. So the $11.8 million wouldn't go down dollar for dollar, it'd be more like a 2/3. So that's just something to consider. A caution, just a little bit of caution. We have a very ambitious long-range plan, and our capital reserve, our only source of local funds to match, like when we need to do a grant, when we want to do a grant, we have to do a match, a 20% match or a 10% match, depending on what kind of capital investment it is. So just a cautionary that if that surplus or that capital reserve is a little bit lower, we're going to have to work a lot harder. Doesn't mean we can't accomplish it. Just means we're going to have to work a lot harder to get more funding for our capital program.
Thank you. I'm just, Matt, I'll let you go in a second. My only comment is I think we'll get questions from the public of, hey, you got 12 million bucks just sitting there. Why can't we add more service in Ipsy Township, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm trying to get ahead of that, but go ahead, Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I only want to paraphrase what Dina just said. Essentially, what you asked about using the surplus to advance initiatives is what the board discussed and approved in 2021 when you voted on the process of filling the capital reserve with the local funding offset by the federal relief funding. At that time, and I still would advise the same, the highest and best use of the one-time funds that are resulted there are, as Dina said, for one-time projects, the capital budget in particular. And as Dina just said, that is our weakest link is in how we come up with a local match for those bigger projects, with the terminals, garages, bus rapid transit. It is, however, excuse me, within the board's power to redirect those fundings as bridge funding to advance the operational costs of one of the services, for example, that's been approved in the millage. That's essentially what we are proposing to do with those 5 FTEs. They were part of the millage. They are operating costs. We are proposing to use, as Dina said, either savings from elsewhere in the budget or the relief to fund those in the interim until the millage funding kicks in. That's what I call the bridge funding. You can tell I've done too many mortgages that I talk about bridge financing. But that's how I've explained it and characterized it to staff. We're comfortable proposing that because 5 FTEs is a relatively small dollar amount. It's just not a very big number. To go further into that, I think would materially affect the expectations and standards that you guys voted on about sending the vast bulk of that offset local relief funding into the capital reserve to be used for those large projects. But that is something the board could reconsider if you'd like.
Thank you. Anything else on the operating budget? Questions, comments?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Now I'll do an overview of the capital budget. The capital budget highlights are that we provide $14 million for fleet and facility capital investment. This is largely our formula funds. We're replacing 8 low-emission diesel buses as part of our vehicle replacement plan, roof and HVAC replacements. All of these initiatives and this $14 million are part of our requirement to maintain our assets in a state of good repair. We're also providing some funding for technology upgrades, bus stop improvements, and transit signal priority. And we're including plan and design funding, as I mentioned before, for the YTC the BTC beginning in 2024 and longer-term expansion projects. Inflationary factors are significant risks in the capital plan estimates. I wanted to mention to you, we do include inflationary estimates, but with the level of inflation we're seeing, I will tell you in FY23, we're protected slightly with our contract for buses in that we are only going to pay up to the cap, which is 4% increase on our buses, but they asked us for a 10% increase. We're holding firm to our contract so that we can manage costs and further our capital funding into the future years. But once that contract is complete and we have to go out for bid again, it's not next year though, I think it's just over a year, we should be good. But those are the types of risk I'm talking about. We don't know what those inflationary impacts will be. Good news is we're fully funded for 23. And as we move forward, we're going to continue to monitor the industry and how things go and make updated assumptions and share that with you as we move through our projection period. As I just said, our capital budget is fully funded, $16.7 million for fiscal year 23. The entire 10-year budget plan is not fully funded. And you'll see at the bottom where it says unidentified funding, we have 36% of our FY 24 to 32 program is not funded. And I've got a graph coming up that'll kind of talk a little bit more specifics about that, but relevant here is just all the key capital projects and funding sources that we're using. I do want to note here that we are using a federal earmark for the YTC. That's part of the planning and design for the YTC. And so that's already slated in to use as soon as we can reasonably do so. We've talked a lot about the capital reserve, so this is a snapshot of where we see things going through 2030 of what we expect to be in the capital reserve over the next 10 years. The remaining capital reserve balance at the bottom there goes up and down based on our sources and use of the capital reserve. And you can see that at a high, we're using about $43.6 million for capital reserve for projects, capital reserve for capital projects. And as we get into 24 and 25, we're still increasing that reserve, but as we move forward into 26, we're going down. We're going to use $57.3 million of pandemic relief funds, and $36.5 million of local funds will be dedicated to the capital reserve over the projection period. The 43.6 also includes some other reserves if we're able to exceed like our surplus. Some of that could come from potential short-term 1 or 2 year surpluses related to the millage and the expenses, that the graph that I showed you earlier where there's like a little bit of a gap. So there's a few $1 million that would come from that if projections hold that far out. The 10-year capital plan does require more funding, as I just said, and this is kind of a snapshot of which ones are funded and which ones are not. You can see that our vehicles are funded. The only part of the vehicles that are unfunded are really part of long-range plan initiatives, and they're in future years. So it doesn't impact our ability to replace our current fleet on our replacement cycle. I just want to make that clear. It's just that we have built into our projections some additional vehicles that we may need in the future in the longer term, and those aren't funded yet because they're in years to come. So existing facilities, YTZ, other transit projects, TEP upgrades, of which are detailed in your packet, are all funded. And when we really start getting to the unfunded projects, it's the big projects. It's the BRT, it's the bus garage and the associated BRT. Those are not funded, as you might expect. We'll have a lot of work to do. And we have a plan in place to start getting the word out about our long-range plan. There is funding in the budget to engage with a federal lobbyist. We've been doing that some this year, and we want to continue that. And our responsibility is to let people know, the people who have the power to influence our funding, what our plans are and how we plan to execute on that. I will say for you and for the public that the millage support is a huge factor in demonstrating the type of commitment that this organization has to our communities to deliver service. And that will fare very well when we go to the Washington DC or Lansing and talk about whether or not we'll be able to get a grant funding and or ongoing funding to fund these projects. So thanks to the public for acknowledging that and voting for that millage that will help us in our future projects as well. Sure. Yeah, sorry.
So, yeah, sorry. The electric bus part, is that the alternative propulsion?
Yes, that's 0 right
Okay.
now. It's on there as a placeholder.
And so when that does become some color bar, is it expected that it's going to be gray or blue?
For right now, it would be gray, but depending on the type of propulsion we use, what we envision is we would phase it in as part of our replacement plan. So what we'll have to do is true up what we're currently planning to spend on the buses we have today versus the new cost of the buses. And what will happen is we'll use our formula funding, which is our 5307 money. That money will get used sooner than what we had planned, or to a greater extent, and it might take away from other things that we can do with that money. So we'll have to weigh that in the balance of how quickly we can phase in the alternative propulsion buses. Additionally, it would be, I'm sure, considered as part of the BRT and the bus garage and buses related to the BRT. So it would be phased, it will be a phased in approach, and it will just increase the costs. So we will be able to fund them, but we may have to slow down our overall funding of buses or sacrifice a different capital project in order to have enough money to fund it. There's always a trade-off. Yes.
When you say, so talk about the dark blue there, when you say that that has funding, is that entirely out of the capital funds, or is that making an assumption that grants, making an assumption of like federal matching?
Yes, we make those assumptions for sure. I'm going to back up 2 slides. This gives you an idea. So for fiscal year 23, you can see that state and federal grants funding the budget this year, 16.5 million. That's not 1 year of grants, mind you. So when we think about capital planning, we have to think that it spans multiple years. It's not a 1-year thing. We get a grant, we have 3 years to spend it. We spend it to the extent possible. So this year, that actual funding exceeds what we would get in 1 year, but we have funds from previous grant years that we're applying to these projects and finishing them out. Did Matt, you want to say something?
Clarification, because if you think this is confusing, just, Dina and I could blow your minds. Where you see the list, state and federal grants, I believe that refers to formula.
Yes, that's mostly
Okay.
our formula.
We also get competitive grants. Those are the ones that are gray in the bar chart that we haven't paid for yet. They're also grants. These are very different grants. The formula grants we get automatically through a formula. The competitive grants are competitive. We have to hustle for those. That's why the local match matters so much. That's why those millage funds are so valuable to us. If we want a $100 million building, the feds want to see local skin in the game. Realistically, you're going to have to bring about $50 million of it, just to put that in perspective. The way Dina has labeled it in the preceding table was unidentified funding. But it's going to be a grant. It's just a different kind of competitive grant as opposed to the formula grants. And to belabor this just a little bit more, she and I and the team will have to discuss a lot when that, and it shouldn't be labeled electric bus, it should just be zero emissions. We haven't decided on the technology. No problem. Absolutely, a bar will appear there. And part of it will be blue and part of it will be gray. And how we've pulled anything out of one of the other blue bars to pay for that, I'm going to need to explain that to you as part of our recommendation of starting that project at all, adding it into the capital budget, whether the cost is coming in this year, because when you approve this budget, just as a clarity, you only approve the first year of it. She's providing you a 10-year contextual window, but it's just the first year that you actually approve. So if we adjust any of that, that would be the capital budget amendment that I mentioned in my propulsion stuff, going from this, which is what we're recommending you consider for September approval, to, well, this is the 10-year. This to, wow, there's another bar there, and the rest of these bars had to shift around.
I appreciate you saying that, because I think I had actually been thinking about competitive grants, thinking about our previous attempts to get funding for the YTC, I think with build grants and getting rejected. So I was wondering if this was all going to be dependent on those same sorts of competitive grants, but it sounds like, no, this is like, we can anything that's dark blue, we can do. We don't have to compete for that money. I'm assuming competitive grants for things like the YTC are still available. Will we be going for those kind of grants with the intention that then we could take that money that we had allocated and increase the size of the dark blue bars on the other projects?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's actually one of my bullets on this slide to mention as a capital grants update really quickly. We are really actively pursuing grants now. We'll continue to do that, and we'll need to do that in order to complete this capital plan. Like I mentioned before, we received the $300,000 earmark for YTC. The other earmarks that we submitted for this year have been really largely unsuccessful, although I think we're still in the running for potentially some money for the YTC, but we won't know until after November. There's going to be a continuance on the budget, and they're probably not going to make decisions about that until after that. And so we're really uncertain about that. But that doesn't mean that we're not trying, and we're not trying to get that message out. We also did not receive, I'll be there. We also did not, no, I get you. We also did not receive any funding from the RAISE grant that we submitted, and that is disappointing, although it's not really unexpected. My experience in this area is that it takes time. You have to really get the message out there. You have to have the long-term plan will really help us. The additional millage that we just passed will help us. Additional reports and things that we have to prepare will allow us to go for a low-no grant in the future, but we're not ready for that yet because there are boxes that we have to check and studies that we have to do. And so we are funding those studies and the planning and design now in order to get prepared and go forward with even a stronger message. And the more that you do that, the more you get heard, and hopefully you get more funding. That's our strategy to approach that. Did I answer all of your questions first?
Yes, thank you. That was great. That was exactly what I wanted to hear.
Thank you. Kathleen.
Thank you, Dina. My question circles back to when we're talking about buses and bus replacement. I remembered that a while back, a few years ago, the board approved for paratransit buses to be owned by us, not the contractor. And so are paratransit buses also included in this, or when we're talking buses, we're only talking fixed route?
The only buses that are in here right now are fixed route. We have, I'd have to look back at the history in terms of when we purchased the buses for para, but we are meeting any replacement plan that we have would be included in the capital plan. I don't think that we have to replace any buses right now, and that's why they're not in the 23 plan. But to the extent that we would have to do that, they would be incorporated into the capital plan.
And this might not be the most appropriate place to ask that, but are they also involved in the propulsion study, the paratransit fleet?
Not really at this point.
Okay.
The main thrust of the propulsion is, how are we going to move the big buses? When that decision gets made, that's probably going to drive what moves all the other vehicles.
Okay.
There's also a trade-off of what moves a large bus versus what moves the small bus. We may find that one technology makes more sense in the large application and a different technology makes sense in the other application. So we're sort of breaking it into chunks, one bit at a time. The large buses also have a 12-year lifespan, so that's kind of a bigger commitment to make. The paratransit buses, what are they, like 5, 6?
Yes.
It's a much
yes,
shorter
5,
term. They turn over a lot faster.
Oh, okay.
So we can catch up on those very quickly.
Thank you.
Ms. Polly?
So I have a dumb question and a bigger question. The dumb question is the new garage at the location of the current garage?
This would be a new garage to support the BRT, and the location has not been determined.
Got it,
We're
okay.
gonna, that's
So
part
it
of the
supports the
planning and
BRT.
design.
Got
It's
it.
Yes, we will need additional buses for the BRT, and so we need a separate garage. It's not a replacement.
Because I thought I saw that there was like no dollars for property acquisition, so it would be on are we assuming it'll be on a piece of land that we currently?
I don't think we're at that stage yet where we've determined
Got it.
where it would be or how we might acquire the land.
Okay.
To clarify on that, the next phase of the garage work is site assessment, looking at where they might make sense. The land acquisition costs are buried in the larger capital budget for that. We just haven't even gotten to a point where we don't have a site in mind yet. We haven't even evaluated them. NEPA, just to scare everybody.
Yeah.
We're gonna go through a lot of that. So the land acquisition costs at this point, if I ask Forrest, I'm sure he's got an assumption buried in there. I just don't know what it is, but it's buried in the capital cost.
Okay. And then the second larger question has to do with how we're funding capital. The world I used to live in, we funded through bond issuances. And is the agency able to issue bonds based on its primary millage, which is an ongoing in perpetuity millage versus the 5-year millages? Is the agency able to support capital projects based on that?
We could only do by law revenue bonds. And we looked at that and that we decided, no, we're not gonna take on debt if we don't have to. Could we do more? But yeah, by law, we can only do revenue bonds, and we kind of decided against that years ago. But,
And I guess
it's a very limited option, bonds based on projected revenues or so we can't do a bond issuance through some other bond.
So I guess with all the capital on our horizon, maybe that's something we could revisit, because one of the things I heard is that the tax base is growing. And so I would assume that refers to like our basic millage, not the 5 years that we keep renewing, but the initial millage. And I'm just curious, because we're so constrained by how much money's in the piggy bank that determines how much we can do and when we can do it. But when we start getting into these bigger projects, it may enable us to be more flexible if we revisit that question, just to see where that might get us. I'm just being the newbie. I'm opening up a question you guys have already explored, but
we have talked about it, and the revenue bonds have to be funded through, obviously, and backed by revenues, and it's fairly limited in what we can do with those revenue bonds. So a lot of these, so for instance, if we were looking to make everything in the BRT gray blue, the revenue bonds probably wouldn't cover that. I mean, it's a fairly limited window, but happy to sit down with you and go offline with it and talk to you about it. But and we can talk about it. But it's a limited opportunity, not impossible, but it's a fairly limited scope.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. It is a very complex question, and there are lots of nuances to it. So thank you for bringing it up, and I'll make a note of it. Okay, any other questions on capital? Just one last thing I wanted to note on page 80 of your board packet. This is to Mr. Miller. You had a question about funding sources and so on. There's a very detailed schedule in the budget book on page 80 of your board packet. If you want to review that, and if you have any follow-up questions at a later time, I'd be happy to answer those for you. So in conclusion, while we know that costs are increasing generally, we're able to manage those cost increases, the impacts of inflation, and we're using pandemic relief funds currently, but we have a longer term plan now, a sustainable plan with our approved millage through the projection period. We will maintain transportation services through 2023, full services, which are returning this month, to continue to assist the community through the recovery of the pandemic. We will plan, design, and fund capital projects for facilities projects and critically important services to our communities. We will manage the impacts of inflation to the extent that we can by being proactive in analyzing what is happening and making business decisions about how to address that. We have a challenging labor market. We've addressed that. We have a four-year contract with our union that we just implemented this year that gives us stability in terms of what our costs will be. And it's proven so far quite effective in terms of attracting more labor to the opportunities that we have open. For the first time, I think I was asked, can we hire a few more people, even though it's above the head count, because we have them. And by the time they actually get into training or through training, we're going to have attrition, and we won't exceed the total. And to that I said yes, because I want to be proactive in making sure that we can meet our service requirements. And we are, of course, watching the budget and making sure that we're in budget. But that's an important part of the proactive strategy that the management team is having, those discussions in order to maintain service and manage costs. We're also going to progress on initiatives that further the board's ends. We're not just going to sit still and worry about inflation. We're going to manage it, and we're going to be focused on moving forward and improving the ride. We are financially stable with a fiscal balanced 23 budget, and we are financially stable through the projection period. That concludes my high-level overview and remarks. Like I said before, there is a detailed report in your packet which will be updated when I present a recommended budget for your approval next month. We'll continue to update the board in committee meetings about how things are going through the budget process, and there will be some assumption changes and changes as we move through the process. But that concludes my presentation for today. Thank you very much, and I'm still open for questions if there are any.
All right, thank you. We will, in accordance with state law, open up the public hearing for this. I'd need a motion from someone on the board to suspend our regular meeting to have the public hearing. Can I have somebody move that? Ms. Pauley, can I have somebody second that? Ms. Sims, all in favor of going to the public hearing, raise your hand. Any opposed? Thank you. If anybody from the public would like to address us, you have up to.
Eric, can I interrupt? I was trying to vote no because I wanted to make a couple of comments before we went into the public meeting.
The board comments will be part of the public meeting, Mike.
All right, that's fine.
Okay. So if any members of the public want to address the board right now, if you are on the phone, hit *9. If you are on the Zoom, hit the raise hand icon, but state your name and the jurisdiction you reside in, whether it's Ann Arbor, Ipsy Township, or other. You'll have up to 3 minutes. Deb, do we have anybody?
We do. Robert Palowski, you are unmuted.
Thank you, Deborah. Good evening, everyone. Robert Pulowski again. Wayne County. I just want to take a minute to talk about the budget. Really well thought through. I was at the public hearing about 2 weeks ago when Matt presented, and I did put out some keynotes about retaining drivers and everybody to AAATA, for jobs of employment. This is a growing system for employment. You can raise a family under the wages that you guys are offering, which is a really good system for the system that we have size-wise. And the other thing I was thinking about during the presentation, besides retaining drivers and employees, was also the ridership. Now, retaining and attracting ridership to the system, the campaign that we had for the long range plan were, for example, Briarwood Mall had boards and commercial boards, if we wanted to put it like that, where the ride is essential for everyone. And the ride is essential for everyone, but what about a campaign slogan besides, texts, emails, campaign slogans at local malls and libraries, but also investing in billboards right off of I-94 and US 23. Just one would change the perception, especially for newcomers into the city, that are not familiar with transit, but automatically know what the ride is when seeing that billboard if visiting the city. For example, the art fair. I talked with 2 people that were visiting the art fair from Georgia, and they were absolutely impressed by the system. But, the one thing they mentioned to me was there was nothing, that was easy for them to find the bus, and everything was just around parking. And that's the one thing that we really need to look at. But keeping that in consideration, I think with just having a billboard route up these interstates to promote what we see as the future, we'll get more ridership with those billboards. Now, the second thing impacting the fuel costs, I understand, but if we could get more money from the state to, help us within this fuel cost with the inflation, that will really help us. And in terms of the putting more funding to the fixed route, I think that really benefits what's happening in this budget. And I really think that besides our budget, I think we would need more state money if, in my opinion, to get full fixed route. Smart is asking for state money as well to retain their fixed route to full service. And the state is trying to help us, but we have a lot to come, especially now with the November 8th primary coming. But those are my comments, and I'm happy for any questions or follow-up that you guys might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Dina, Deb, do we have anybody else?
We do, Mr. Jim Mogensen, and you are on.
Yes, Jim Mogensen. So one thing that I would like to advocate for is to, I know that the staff people at the YTC they were included as part of the millage, but I think over the long term, they simply need to be incorporated as part of the overall standard budget. That it was not having them was an equity issue. It has become an equity issue. And as a result, they should be incorporated into the general budget. If for some reason in the future a millage wasn't, or if the millage got redirected, I think it's key for the ride to incorporate some of those kinds of operating costs in the regular budget. The second thing relates to and I am not one of those folks who say, well, you've got $11 million, let's throw it at all kinds of stuff. That doesn't make any sense to me. But part of that is because I want to move forward with the planning and development money for the YTC to move that forward. And I say that as a person who remembers when the millage was initially passed. And after that happened, there was lots of discussion about the need to include hybrid buses that were not incorporated into the initial assumptions about the millage finances, that the staff at the time tried to figure out exactly how much things would cost. And because the hybrid buses were more expensive, it contributed to that gap. And I just bring that up as I believe that the BRT, the Washtenaw BRT, is one of those items that may be in conflict with the need to do to the the BRT on Washtenaw and the full BRT on Washtenaw and the possible propulsion changes that people may want. So thank you for all your hard work, and thank you very much for letting me speak. And if there's a possibility of further written comment, I'll do that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Deb, do we have anybody else?
We do not.
All right. Thank you for your comments, and we'll take those under advisement as we prepare our final budget for next month. And we'll open it up for board member questions now for Dina. Mike, sorry. Should have been the first guy I looked at.
Well, first of all, I really wanted to compliment Dina on putting together what I consider an outstanding budget. And her overview that she presented tonight, I mean, just laid it out so well, so logically. I think it had to be an overview to be presented this way, and it was. And it covered really the major things that needed to be covered. But I really, and I think the board and the public who have looked at this and heard her presentation should have a whole lot of confidence that AATA's finances are in really good hands. But I also want to encourage everybody, particularly the board members, who haven't had the opportunity to read the detailed 60-page package that was in our board materials. It's really, really enlightening. It's so well done. It's, I think, the best budget package I've ever seen, and I've had lots and lots and lots of years of experience in looking at these kinds of things, primarily in the corporate world, but also for many years in the nonprofit world. I mean, she lays out so well and so logically, starting with the assumptions that underlie everything, how those assumptions then get translated into numbers and explain how that happens. It's extremely well written, easy to understand, I think. It's nice that she lays out the risks and opportunities, which frequently doesn't happen in budgets, except by answering questions from people like me. I mean, I just think it's outstanding, and it's 60 pages. It will take a while, but by reading the entire thing, everybody can really get a wonderful understanding of how AAATA operates, not just the financial side, because it explains what's underneath it, or what's really above these numbers is of course the operations. It's really outstanding, Dina. Congratulations, and I have no doubt that there'll be another plaque on the wall in the Donggabe Center about this particular budget. And it's done in such difficult circumstances. My God, the pandemic, now the unexpected inflation. You were out for a couple of weeks in all of this. The cyber attack. I mean, it's just all these things on top of each other, and look at what Dina has ended up with. Of course, with the help of a lot of other people. I'm very impressed, and I think the whole board, I hope, shares my opinion on that, and I really hope the whole board will read the entire package, because you will learn a lot. It's so much better than a typical budget where there's just thousands and thousands of numbers, like it was actually when I first joined the board of AATA, and no real understanding of what the big picture is, or what any of these numbers mean. Dina can just synthesize that all together in a very logical, understandable way. So again, thanks, Dina.
Thank you, Mike. Other comments, questions? Jesse?
I had some questions about the value added portion, particularly the we always kind of have like bus shelters in the budget. It's just kind of like a standing item. But I was wondering if you could actually speak a little bit more to what the plans are. What are the aims for? I'm particularly interested in the slabs, the pedestrian paths, and the shelters.
You mean from a planning point of view, or just?
Well, yeah. So there's a certain budget amount added, included a $445,000. But like, I mean, knowing that we tend to talk about this a lot when it comes to treatment of the riding public and like ADA concerns. We talk about how where a lot of our stops are lacking. There's a lot of our stops that don't have slabs. There's a lot of stops with slabs that don't have shelters. So I was wanting to spend a little bit more time kind of going into what are our actual, I've heard referenced a plan for stop improvements, but I've never actually seen the plan. And so I'm kind of wanting to dig into that since we're now, well, yeah, I want to dig into that some more.
Okay, I just want to ask, this is part of the public hearing. Typically with a public hearing, we're more listening to comments and not necessarily responding. So I'm happy to respond to Mr. Miller. I'm just wondering if we should close the public hearing first and then have continued discussion, or however you think it's appropriate.
Yeah, no, you're right. We need to, we can close this part out. So pending that question, why don't we just, I need a motion from somebody on the board to close the public hearing real quick from, as a formality. Rich, seconded by Jesse. All in favor of closing the public hearing? That's closed. So I take your question to be in terms of how we arrived at that number and what that really represents and what's the planning behind that, et cetera.
What are we specifically hoping to accomplish? Like, do we have a certain number of shelters in mind? Are we looking for putting more real-time info at more existing shelters? What is the scope of that project over the course of the next year?
So I don't have all the details up to the level that you're asking. I'm going to ask you if I can follow up on some of those more intricate details after the budget discussion, when I can have a conversation with Forrest and make sure we get that information correct. I will share with you that in your packet on page 88, there's a section, well, there's a section that starts on page 87 that is 8.2 capital descriptions. It goes into a fair amount of detail, a summary version of level of detail on what each of these projects are, and correlates that with the budget. The value added projects start on page 88. And so if you look through that and you see bus stop improvements, bus lane improvements, zero emissions vehicles, it gives a little more color.
I'm sorry, Dina, just to interrupt. I think there's a pagination issue.
I'm sorry.
What Dina's referring to on capital descriptions in my packet starts on page 90.
Sorry,
And the
thank you for-
value added section starts on page 91.
So any further level of detail, I'd have to follow up and get more information, and I'm happy to do that. Are there any particular projects you would like to focus on, or just that section in general?
No, it's particular. Well, I think there had been something about how shelters, it looked like there was going to be a focus on the Washington Avenue corridor, but I was wondering, they didn't say like to what extent. So I guess that's something that I get asked about a lot, and I'd like to have a better answer for people. And I'm just, as a bus rider, I'm also interested in that. I do have a ride on the Washington corridor, but yeah, I would like to see that played. I don't necessarily think it needs to be included in the budget, but I would like to have that kind of that information.
Okay, is it acceptable that we follow up on that? Okay, thank you.
I do want to add, sorry, Dina, we're here.
Sorry, I didn't see you
No problem.
waving.
Yeah. Was part of that the super stop on Washtenaw at the sheriff's office?
I'm not sure.
Okay, and I'll, try not to put my foot in my mouth. I think that dollar amount is divided between a particular stop on Washtenaw, the tail end of sort of the reimagined Washtenaw super stop concepts. I believe it's slated near Carpenter Road at the sheriff and the county service center. The rest of it is made up of concrete work for lead walks. I think shelters and benches are also in there. The distinction is that with the lead walks, we've already committed, and you may recall this, we're going to lead walk every bus stop that we can. There needs to be a sidewalk near it. We can't put a lead walk to nothing, nor can we put a shelter or a bench without bringing the entire bus stop up to ADA standards, which means an accessible path of travel. So if we put a bench at a bus stop on grass and there is no sidewalk to connect it to, we're breaking the ADA. So it's complicated. Benches and shelters are distributed by a utilization formula. The number of riders matters. We're not going to put a bench or a shelter when there's only one person. It's just not, sorry, it's not worth the cost. But the lead walks were intended to go everywhere until we're done with everything, but that's a many-year project. So Dina will follow up and we'll get more detail, but I think part of what she'll say is that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any others? I want to concur with Mike that it's a very thorough, very well done, and very much worth the time and effort to read, and I appreciate it. I want to be picky with one, but I think it is a significant thing, which is on page 60, the state of the RIDE financial condition. The bullet point list there, I would hesitate and caution against saying things like we have no risk of service cuts or layoffs in 2023. I would rather say we have low risk or no anticipated risk than somebody throwing that in our face if, God forbid, we have a huge spike in some subvariant of the pandemic and all of a sudden we got to cut back on service or something like that. So no anticipated risks. So my general comment is I use that as the one example, but stay away from the absolutes, especially when we're talking about assumptions. And then my only other one is, on figure 20, the 10-year capital plan, I see under value add technology upgrades, FY 2025 to FY 2028, 2.15 million a year for technology upgrades, and I was wondering what that was. And if that's, how that's capitalized.
Those are upgrades associated with the long-range plan.
Okay.
So they will be technology upgrades that we would incorporate for service improvements. It's not like a internal.
But we don't know if those are bus or if those are operation,
There are assumptions in the
Okay.
long-range plan that I can identify.
If I might, I think it's probably includes fare collection equipment,
It does.
intelligent real-time information systems, passenger-facing technology systems.
but not,
Dean-
this isn't propulsion.
No, that dollar amount's way too small.
Okay, that's, well, I see it go from 150 to 2.5, and it's got to mean something, right? There's something baked in there, and if and it continues for 5 years or 4 years, then stops. And I assume maybe that's just because that's when the millage stops, and maybe we don't have any projections after that, but
I think it's all linked to the
can't be
long-range
propulsion.
plan.
It is only, yeah. And so what I'll do is, to your point, I'll go pull some detail out of the long-range plan and incorporate it into the budget document.
That's fine.
Yeah. It is, I know there's fare collection in there, so I know that's one thing, but I can't list everything offhand, so
Yeah, that's fine.
I'd be happy to put it in there.
Those are my 2 comments. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Dina.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward to getting a complete and final draft next month, before next month. All right, finally, the 4.3, our CEO report. Back over to Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one thing to note. A few days after the millage, we did begin the execution of the board's approved fare changes. I want to apologize to the board. I know we caught a couple of you off guard with that announcement. It was merely the fare changes that you approved as part of last year's budget, or this year's budget, I should say. And on behalf of Brian and myself, just sort of apologize. The execution of that was intended for much earlier in the year. If that's what you remember, you're not hallucinating. That was the case. Events overtook us, cyber attack, COVID, many other things, and this one simply, we didn't deliver it until much later in the year than we had planned, but we did schedule it to be sort of after the millage, because doing it right before the millage maybe wouldn't have been, it was like, let's not go there. And so we are getting it in, admittedly under the wire this fiscal year, but it will be executed in the year you approved it. So my apologies if that caught any of you off guard. And that's all I'll say. If there are any questions, happy to answer.
Any questions on the CEO report? I think it's important to note that we inspired action of other counties when 8 days after we won our millage, Oakland County decided to put their own transit increase millage on the ballot for November. Bandwagon jumpers, anyway. Yeah. Anybody else? Any emergent items that are not on the agenda? Any closing items? You see the list there. I think budget presentation / adoption might be, let's be optimistic and say we'll call it budget adoption. And also don't forget officer elections are next month as well. We got to put that on there. Any other comments about closing items? Topics for next meeting? Any other closing items? All right, we're back to public comment. Again, if you want to address the board, you have up to 3 minutes. And if you are remote, please hit the raise hand icon or *9 if you're on the phone. Deb, do you have anybody who wants to address the board?
We do. Robert Palowski, and you are unmuted.
Thank you, Deborah. So just to close off, I just want to thank Matt for all the hard work on the propulsion study. I want to save those comments for the board retreat, but I do think it was really well done. And I just want to thank Matt for all the hard work on that. Also, the fare structure. The fare structure was one of the biggest things that the board has talked about throughout 2021. And now we're finally starting to see changes. So I just want to say thank you. And I look forward to seeing fare changes. But the one thing that we're doing here with the fare changes is implementing something to where, if a rider's short on a dime, and students only have a certain amount of money at a time each month, whether it's an allowance or how much they get paid monthly at their job, that's going to really help them financially. So, and AAATA is really geared to, if you can't afford certain fare, you can either buy passes and save that money, and Smart and DDOT did the same thing, but not to the extent that Ann Arbor is doing. So, and now with this fare structure going in place the 28th, I look forward to the best and seeing a lot of happy faces on the bus throughout the months ahead. The last few things I want to bring up is Brian. I know it's been a short time since, we've seen each other. It's been virtually, but I think you've done a really good job at TheRide, and all your hard work pays off from all the planning and all the, stuff you've done behind the scenes and, presenting it in front of the public. And the amount of feedback we've gotten from it has just been absolutely amazing. So all the hard work you've done, thank you for everything that you've done. Your legacy shows, and you will always be remembered here at TheRide. And I wish you the best in Lafayette, Indiana. Again, great job on the millage. Congratulations. Let's focus on the future, and let's focus on our budget. Thank you, Dina. But as always, hope to see everyone next month in person. Take care.
Thank you. Deb, do we have anybody else?
We do. Mr. Jim Mogensen, and you are unmuted.
Yes, Jim Mogensen. So I just wanted to say, follow up and say, thank you, Mr. Smith, for all your work. It was an incredibly difficult time. We will miss you. I always felt that you were taking us seriously and with respect. And again, thank you much for all your work. And hopefully we'll find someone who can move your legacy forward. The second is to say, if there's a way, if it's not incorporated into the 60-page budget document, which I confess I did not read, I have it, but if Ms. Reed's presentation is available, that would be helpful. One thing, as conversations are happening in the community, in the past, long past, the purchase of service agreements were available, and some of this material doesn't have to be in the presentations, but from my standpoint, some of the material, it would be beneficial to have, in addition to some of the, like the fare policy document and the paratransit document, and soon the propulsion document, to have some of those additional documents immediately available so people wouldn't have to FOIA them or try to manage discussions without them. So that would be like the purchase of service agreements, the agreement with the University of Michigan, the official policy agreement with TheRide. And I know some things about that that are ridiculously minute, but to have, so that when conversations happen in the community, some of those kind of things are available. And again, thank you very much for all your work, the staff and the board for taking the time to do this and for volunteering your time to do this. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Deb, do we have anybody else?
We do not.
Okay, we'll close the public comment period. Can I have somebody move to adjourn? Kathleen, seconded by Jesse. All in favor of adjournment, raise your hand. Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.